Hello, everyone, and welcome back to X-Ranger. Before we begin, I thought it would be interesting if each of you could leave a comment indicating which part of the world you're joining us from. Also, don't forget to like and subscribe if you're enjoying the episodes. Now let's get comfortable, relax, and start our program. Story 1. It was a moonless night, pitch black, except for the glow of campfires dotting the grounds. My friend Tommy and I were bored sitting around with our parents, so we decided to go for a little walk around the campground. We grabbed our flashlights and told our folks we'd be back in a bit. As we wandered down the dirt paths between campsites, we could hear bits of conversation and laughter drifting through the trees. The air was thick and humid, and clouds of mosquitoes swarmed around the light of our flashlights. We swatted them away as we walked, our shoes crunching on the gravel. We'd been walking for maybe 10 or 15 minutes when we heard it. At first, it was just a faint, rustling sound coming from the woods to our right. We paused and shined our lights toward the trees, but couldn't see anything. "Probably just a raccoon or something," Tommy said with a shrug. But then we heard it again, louder this time. It wasn't the scurrying of a small animal. These were heavy footsteps, like something big moving through the underbrush. My heart started racing. Maybe we should head back," I stammered. Tommy nodded, his eyes wide. We turned to go back the way we came, walking a bit faster now. But the footsteps seemed to be keeping pace with us, moving parallel to the path we were on. Whatever it was big and fast. I remember the hairs on the back of my neck standing up as I realized how quickly and smoothly it was moving through the dense forest. There were no sounds of branches snapping or bushes rustling, just steady, powerful strides. How could something that big move so silently through all those trees and obstacles in pitch darkness? Tommy and I exchanged a terrified glance. We both knew this wasn't normal. Without a word, we broke into a run. The footsteps in the woods sped up too, easily keeping pace with us. My legs were trembling as I ran, my breath coming in ragged gasps. I was sure at any moment some horrible creature was going to burst out of the trees and grab us. As we sprinted down the path, I risked a glance over my shoulder. For just a split second, I thought I saw something. A massive dark shape moving through the trees, easily 7 or 8 feet tall. But it was gone so fast I couldn't be sure. We finally made it back to our campsite, out of breath and shaking. Our parents looked at us with concern and asked what was wrong. But how could we explain? They'd never believe us. Nothing, I panted. We just got spooked by some animal noises. I barely slept at all that night. Every snapping twig or rustling leaf made me jump. I kept imagining that huge, shadowy figure lurking just outside our tent. The next morning, Tommy and I talked about what happened in hushed voices. We both agreed. Whatever was in those woods last night wasn't human, and it wasn't any normal animal either. But we didn't tell anyone else. Who would believe 2 kids claiming they were chased by some kind of monster? As the day went on and the sun shone brightly, it was easy to convince ourselves we'd just let our imaginations run wild in the dark. But deep down, I knew what I'd heard and seen was real. It wasn't until years later that I started researching and came across local Bigfoot sightings in that exact area. The descriptions matched perfectly with what Tommy and I experienced that night. The incredible speed and silence, the huge size, the way it moved with eerie skill through pitch-black forest. Reading those accounts sent chills down my spine as I realized what we'd likely encountered. It was both terrifying and oddly thrilling to finally put a name to the mysterious creature that had haunted my memories for so long. To this day, I can't explain exactly what happened that night at Bayview Campground, but I know it was real, and I know it wasn't human. Whatever that thing in the woods was, it moved with a grace and power that still amazes and frightens me all these years later. Sometimes I wonder if it's still out there, silently roaming those dark Massachusetts forests. And I wonder how many other campers have heard those swift, heavy footsteps in the night, felt that prickling fear as they realized something unnatural was moving through the shadows just beyond the glow of their campfire. I've never been camping since that summer. The thought of being out in those woods at night, knowing what might be lurking in the darkness, is more than I can handle. That experience changed me. It opened my eyes to the fact that there are things in this world we can't explain, creatures that defy our understanding of what's possible. Sometimes late at night, when the house is quiet and dark, I'll hear a sudden sound outside my window, branches creaking or leaves rustling, and for a split second, I'm transported back to that night. My heart races and I break out in a cold sweat as I imagine those heavy footsteps, that massive shadowy figure moving with impossible silence and speed. In those moments, I have to remind myself that I'm safe, that I'm far from those woods now. But a part of me wonders, are any of us truly safe? How many other unnatural things are out there, just beyond the edge of the light, watching and waiting? I don't have answers. I just know what I experienced that night was real, and I know I'll never forget the terror of realizing we weren't alone in those dark woods, that something was out there, something faster, stronger, and far more terrifying than anything I'd ever imagined could exist. So, if you're ever camping in those Massachusetts forests, and you hear strange footsteps in the night, footsteps moving too quickly and too quietly through the dense woods, don't try to convince yourself it's just your imagination. Don't assume it's only the wind or some normal forest creature, because it might be something else entirely. Something that shouldn't exist, but somehow does. Something watching from the shadows, waiting for the right moment to reveal itself and shatter everything you thought you knew about the world. I hope you never have to experience what Tommy and I did that night. But if you do, trust your instincts. Run. And pray whatever is out there doesn't decide to chase you down. Because based on how easily it kept pace with us, I have a feeling that if it had truly wanted to catch us, there's no way we could have outrun it. The fact that it let us escape might be the most terrifying part of all. It makes me wonder, was it just toying with us, testing us? Or maybe it was holding back, not yet ready to fully reveal itself to the world. All I know is, I'll never stop wondering about what really happened that night, and I'll never stop looking over my shoulder, half expecting to see that massive, shadowy figure emerging from the trees, moving with that uncanny silence and grace that still haunts my dreams to this day. Story 2. After that night, things just got weirder. I started hearing odd noises around the property, not normal wildlife sounds, but eerie howls and screams that made my hair stand on end. Sometimes I'd be working in the garden and get this intense feeling of being watched. I'd whip around, heart pounding, but never saw anything. Just this oppressive sense that something was out there, observing me. It all came to a head one evening in January. I was taking out the trash at dusk when movement caught my eye. I turned and saw something running straight at me from the tree line. In the fading light, I couldn't make out details, just a dark, bulky shape charging in my direction. I'm not ashamed to admit I screamed and ran for the house. Thank God for that chain-link fence. The thing slammed into it with enough force to rattle the posts. By the time I worked up the courage to peek out the window, whatever it was had vanished. After that, I started keeping a baseball bat by the door and carrying bear spray whenever I went outside. I was on edge constantly, jumping at every little sound. A few weeks later, I was up late reading when I heard heavy footsteps on the porch. Clutching my bat, I crept to the window and peeked through the blinds. What I saw nearly made my heart stop. There was a creature standing there, right outside my house. It was huge, at least 7 feet tall, and covered in silvery fur that seemed to shimmer in the moonlight. But the scariest part was how human-like it was. It stood on two legs and had these long, muscular arms ending in what looked like hands. Its face. God, its face. It was flat and expressionless, with deep-set eyes that reflected the light like a cat's. Those eyes seemed to stare right through me. I must have made some kind of noise because suddenly its head snapped in my direction. We locked eyes for a split second before it loped off into the darkness with surprising speed and grace for something so large. I didn't sleep a wink that night, or for several nights after. At that point, I knew I needed proof. Not just for others to believe me, but to convince myself I wasn't going crazy. I bought a trail camera and set it up facing the area where I'd seen the creature. For days, nothing showed up on the footage except the usual deer and raccoons. Then one night, the camera captured something bizarre. The timestamp showed it was around 3 a.m. when a strange, shimmering mist appeared on screen. It wasn't like normal fog. This stuff moved with purpose, swirling and coalescing into vaguely humanoid shapes before dissipating again. As I watched the footage, my mouth went dry. This wasn't just some animal. Whatever was visiting my property was intelligent, maybe even supernatural. The incidents continued over the next few months. Sometimes weeks would go by with nothing, then suddenly there'd be a flurry of activity. More UFO sightings, weird prints in the mud that were too big to be from any known animal, eerie lights moving through the woods at night. It was like something was studying the property, testing the boundaries. One time I found a perfect circle of flattened grass in the field behind my house, at least 30 feet across. The grass wasn't just bent over, it was twisted and singed, like it had been subjected to intense heat. Another night, all the neighborhood dogs started howling in unison, a chilling sound that went on for hours. The worst was when I started finding dead animals around the property, rabbits, possums, even a young deer once. They weren't eaten or mauled like a normal predator would do. Instead, they were arranged in unnatural poses, almost like some kind of ritual. That's when I realized whatever this thing was, it wasn't just observing anymore. It was trying to send a message. I considered selling the house and moving, but who would buy a place with all this weird activity? And to be honest, part of me was morbidly fascinated. I'd always been a skeptic, but now I was seeing proof of things I never thought possible. It was terrifying, but also thrilling in a way. As the months went on, the incidents became more frequent and bold. Sometimes I'd wake up to find my porch furniture rearranged or strange symbols carved into the trees at the edge of my property. The trail camera caught glimpses of a large, shadowy figure moving with inhuman speed and agility. One night in early 2020, I was awakened by a deafening roar right outside my bedroom window. It was like nothing I'd ever heard before. Not quite animal, not quite human. When I finally worked up the courage to look outside, I saw deep claw marks gouged into the wooden siding of the house. That was my breaking point. The next day, I called in some paranormal investigators and shared all the evidence I'd gathered. They were blown away, saying it was some of the most compelling proof they'd ever seen. They set up their own equipment around the property and began a stakeout. For days, we waited with bated breath, hoping to catch a glimpse of the creature. But it was like it knew we were looking for it. All activity suddenly ceased. No more sounds, no sightings, nothing on the cameras. It was as if whatever had been terrorizing me for months had simply vanished into thin air. The investigators eventually left, disappointed but intrigued. They promised to analyze all the data and evidence, but I haven't heard much since then. Life has mostly returned to normal now, but I still find myself glancing over my shoulder when I'm outside at night. Sometimes I'll catch a whiff of a musky animal smell on the breeze, or hear a twig snap in the woods, and my heart will start racing. I don't know what to make of everything that happened, Was it some undiscovered species, aliens, something supernatural? All I know is that for those few months, my quiet little slice of rural Florida became ground zero for something beyond my wildest imagination. And even though the activity has stopped, I can't shake the feeling that it's still out there somewhere, watching and waiting. Story 3. I was born and raised in Gaston County, North Carolina, and I've lived here my whole life. It's a beautiful place, with rolling hills, dense forests, and plenty of wildlife. But there's something else out there in those woods, something that defies explanation. I've had 2 encounters with it now, and they've shaken me to my core. The first time was about 5 years ago. I was out with my sister and her daughter, my niece, at the local baseball field. It was a warm summer evening, and we were just tossing a ball around, enjoying the nice weather. My niece was only 6 at the time, full of energy and wanting to run all over the place. As the sun started to set, we decided to head home. That's when my niece spotted something strange near the edge of the outfield. "Uncle Luke, look at that big footprint," she called out excitedly. I figured it was just an impression in the dirt or something, but when we went over to look, my blood ran cold. There in the soft earth was a massive footprint, easily 16 inches long. The toes were clearly defined, 5 of them spread wide. It was unmistakably a foot, but far too large to be human. My sister and I exchanged worried glances, trying not to alarm my niece. That's probably from the grounds crew equipment," I said lamely, knowing full well no machine could leave a print like that. My niece seemed satisfied with the explanation, but my sister gripped my arm tightly, her eyes wide with fear. That's when we heard it, a loud rustling from the tree line about 50 yards away. The bushes shook violently, and I could see the tops of some smaller trees swaying. Whatever was moving through there was big, really big. I scooped up my niece, and we hurried back to the car as fast as we could without running. I kept glancing over my shoulder, half expecting to see some monstrous creature burst out of the woods after us. But we made it to the car without incident. As we drove away, I caught a glimpse of something in my rearview mirror. Just for a second, I saw a large, dark shape step out from the tree line. It was only visible for a moment before disappearing back into the shadows, but it was enough to make my heart race. We didn't talk much on the drive home. My sister and I exchanged meaningful looks, silently agreeing not to discuss what we'd seen in front of my niece. But later that night, after the little one was in bed, we talked it over in hushed tones. "That wasn't a bear, Luke," my sister said, her voice trembling slightly. "It was too big, and the way it moved, it was almost like a person, but huge." I nodded, unable to shake the image of that massive footprint from my mind. "I know. I've heard stories about Bigfoot sightings around here, but I never believed them. Now, I don't know what to think." We agreed to keep it to ourselves. Who would believe us anyway? But that night marked a change in how I viewed the forests around my home. I found myself scanning the tree line whenever I was outside, half expecting to see that dark shape again. For years, nothing happened. Life went on as normal, and I started to wonder if I had imagined the whole thing. But then, about 6 months ago, it happened again, this time much closer to home. I live in a small house on the outskirts of town, backed up against a stretch of dense forest. It's usually quiet out here, which is how I like it. But that night, the silence was shattered by a series of loud thumps against my bedroom window. At first I thought it might be a branch hitting the glass, but the rhythmic nature of the sound made me think otherwise. Thump, thump, thump. It was deliberate, almost like knocking. I got out of bed, heart pounding, and cautiously approached the window. The thumping stopped as I got closer. I pulled back the curtain, half expecting to see a face peering in at me. But there was nothing there. just the dark silhouettes of the trees against the night sky. I was about to go back to bed, telling myself it was just my imagination, when I saw something move in the yard. It was hard to make out in the darkness, but I could swear I saw a large bipedal figure walking across my lawn towards the tree line. I rubbed my eyes, certain I must be seeing things. But when I looked again, it was still there. The figure was easily 7 or 8 feet tall, with long arms that hung down past its knees. It moved with an odd, loping gait, covering ground quickly despite its size. I watched, frozen in place, as it reached the edge of the woods. Just before it disappeared into the trees, it turned and looked directly at my window. I couldn't make out any features in the darkness, but I felt its gaze lock onto me. A chill ran down my spine, and I quickly let the curtain fall back into place. I didn't sleep at all that night. I kept the lights on and sat in my living room, jumping at every little sound. When morning finally came, I ventured outside to look for evidence of what I'd seen. There, in the soft earth near my window, were more of those massive footprints. They led across my yard and into the woods, just as I had seen the figure move. But that wasn't all. Scattered on the ground beneath my window were small pebbles and bits of gravel. Whatever had been out there had been throwing rocks at my window to get my attention. Over the next few weeks, similar incidents occurred. I'd hear thumps on my windows or walls late at night. Sometimes I'd find small objects like pine cones or acorns lined up on my porch in the morning. Once, I even found a cluster of blackberries, still on the branch, left outside my door. Each time, I'd catch glimpses of that large, dark figure moving around my property. It never came too close, always staying near the tree line, but I could feel its presence. It was watching me, studying me. The strange thing was, I never felt threatened. Scared, yes, but not in danger. It seemed more curious than anything else, like it was trying to communicate or interact in some way. I started leaving food out, fruits, nuts, things I thought it might eat. They would always be gone in the morning, with those massive footprints left behind in the dirt. This went on for about a month before suddenly stopping. One day, the visits just ended. No more thumps in the night, no more gifts left on my porch. The woods behind my house fell silent once again. Part of me was relieved, but another part felt almost disappointed. I had grown accustomed to our strange nightly routine, and now I found myself missing it. It's been several months now since the last visit. I still see the occasional footprint in the woods when I go hiking, or hear strange noises late at night. But my nightly visitor seems to have moved on. I don't know what it was, Bigfoot, some unknown species, or something else entirely. But I know what I saw, what I experienced. There's something out there in the forests of Gaston County, something intelligent and curious. And while it may have left me alone for now, I can't shake the feeling that it's still out there, watching and waiting. I've never told anyone else about this, aside from my sister. Who would believe me? But I know what I saw, what I experienced. It was real as anything I've ever known. And while it terrified me at first, now I find myself hoping that someday, somehow, I'll get another chance to interact with whatever it was that visited me those nights. Until then, I'll keep watching the woods, listening for those telltale thumps in the night. Because now I know we're not alone out here. There's something else, something that defies explanation, living right alongside us. And who knows, maybe someday we'll understand what it is and why it's here. But for now, all I can do is wonder and wait and hope for another glimpse of the unknown. Story 4. It was just a normal evening at first. I was out on my property near South Mountain State Park, doing my usual nighttime check on the animals before turning in. The dogs were acting a bit odd, more alert and on edge than usual. I figured maybe there was a coyote or something prowling around. As I made my way around the barn, I heard this weird grunting sound coming from the tree line. It was low and guttural, unlike anything I'd heard before. The hairs on the back of my neck stood up. Something felt very wrong. I shone my flashlight towards the woods, and that's when I saw it. At first I thought my eyes were playing tricks on me. This thing was massive, had to be at least 10 feet tall, maybe more. It was partially obscured by the trees, but I could make out a hulking humanoid shape. My blood ran cold as it stepped forward into the light. It was covered in thick, matted fur. But the face, God, that face! It was almost human-like, but twisted and feral. Yellow, jagged teeth bared in a snarl, and the eyes, glowing and filled with an intelligence that chilled me to my core. I stood there frozen for what felt like an eternity, my heart pounding in my chest. The creature let out another guttural growl and took a lumbering step towards me. That snapped me out of my paralysis. I yelled at it to get back, trying to sound braver than I felt. To my shock, it actually hesitated. It tilted its head, almost curiously, like it was studying me. That's when I noticed its hands, massive things with 6 fingers on each. It flexed them menacingly. My dogs were going absolutely berserk at this point, barking and snarling. The creature's attention snapped to them, and it let out a bone-chilling roar. I was terrified it was going to attack them. Without thinking, I yelled at it again, telling it to leave my dogs alone and get off my property. Incredibly, it seemed to understand me. It looked back at me, let out a low growl, and then slowly backed away into the tree line. I stood there, shaking, flashlight trained on the spot where it had been, for a good 10 minutes before I worked up the courage to move. I rushed back to the house and locked every door and window. Sleep was out of the question. I sat up all night with my shotgun, jumping at every little sound. But it didn't come back, at least not that night. The next morning, I went out to investigate. The ground where it had stood was torn up, with massive footprints sunk deep into the mud. They were huge, easily twice the size of my own foot, and there were tufts of coarse reddish-brown fur caught on some branches. I've lived in these parts my whole life, and I've heard the old stories, whispers of a creature folks called Nobby back in the 70s, but I always thought they were just tall tales. Now, I'm not so sure. I've replayed that night in my head 1,000 times trying to make sense of it. Was it some kind of undiscovered primate, a person in a costume? But no costume could account for those 6-fingered hands, or the sheer size and mass of the thing, and the way it seemed to understand me. That's what really gets me. There was an intelligence in those eyes. This wasn't just some animal. It knew what it was doing, and it chose to leave when I confronted it. I haven't seen it since that night, but I know it's still out there. Sometimes, when I'm out on the property after dark, I get the feeling I'm being watched. I'll hear twigs snapping in the woods, or catch a whiff of a musky animal smell on the breeze. I've thought about reporting it to the authorities, but who would believe me? They'd think I was crazy or on drugs, and part of me is afraid that if I start talking, it might come back. So I've kept quiet until now. I don't know what that thing was, or why it was on my property that night, but I know what I saw. And I know that there are things out there in those woods that defy explanation. I just hope I never come face to face with it again. Since that night, I've become almost obsessed with researching similar encounters. Turns out, there have been sightings of similar creatures all throughout the Appalachians for years. Some folks call it Bigfoot, others have different names, but the descriptions are eerily similar: massive, humanoid, covered in fur. I've connected with a few other people online who claim to have had similar experiences. It's both comforting and terrifying to know I'm not alone. Some of them have had multiple encounters over the years. I don't know if I could handle that. I've taken some precautions since that night. Installed better lighting around the property, set up some trail cams in the woods. So far, nothing concrete has shown up on camera, just some blurry shapes that could be anything. But I know what's out there. The not knowing is the worst part. Was this a one-time thing, or is it still out there watching and waiting? Every time I hear an unexplained noise at night, my heart starts racing. I find myself constantly scanning the tree line, looking for any sign of movement. My friends and family have noticed the change in me. They say I seem on edge all the time, jumpy. I haven't told them the real reason. How could I? They'd think I'd lost my mind. So I keep it bottled up, this secret gnawing away at me. Sometimes I wonder if I imagined the whole thing, if maybe the stress of running the property alone has finally gotten to me. But then I'll come across those footprints again, still visible in the harder soil near the woods, or I'll find another tuft of that coarse fur caught on the fence, and I know it was real. I've thought about selling the place and moving somewhere else, somewhere with fewer shadows for things to hide in. But this land has been in my family for generations. I can't just abandon it because of one terrifying night. So I stay, and I watch, and I wonder. If you're reading this and you've had a similar experience, know that you're not alone. There are things out there that we can't explain, things that shouldn't exist but do. All we can do is stay vigilant and hope that whatever they are, they choose to keep their distance. As for me, I'll keep watching the woods. And if I ever see those glowing eyes staring back at me again, well, I don't know what I'll do. Run, stand my ground, try to communicate. I guess I won't know until it happens. If it happens. God, I hope it doesn't happen. But a part of me, a part I'm not proud of, is almost hoping for another encounter. To prove to myself once and for all that I'm not crazy. To maybe get some answers about what this thing is and why it was here. It's a dangerous curiosity, I know. But once you've seen something like that, how do you just go back to normal life? So I'll keep telling my story, hoping that maybe someone out there has the answers I'm looking for. And I'll keep watching the woods, both dreading and anticipating the day those yellow eyes might peer out at me again from the darkness. Story 5. I grew up as a military brat, moving around a lot due to my dad's career in the Marine Corps. We lived in several states over the years, but it was during our time in Florida that things first got weird. I was about 13 at the time, and we were living near Jacksonville. There were some train tracks that ran through a wooded area not far from our neighborhood, and my friends and I would sometimes hang out there in the evenings. One night, we were walking along the tracks when we started hearing these bizarre sounds coming from the woods. It was like nothing I'd ever heard before, a mix between a howl and a scream, but deeper and more guttural. We all froze, looking at each other with wide eyes. The sound came again, closer this time, and we took off running without a word. As we ran, I glanced over my shoulder and saw movement in the tree line. It was too dark to make out details, but I swear I saw something large moving through the shadows. We didn't stop running until we made it back to the streetlights. The next day, curiosity got the better of me, and I went back to check out the area in the daylight. That's when I found the blood. There were dark stains splattered on some of the railroad ties and smeared on the gravel between the tracks. It looked fresh. I hightailed it out of there and didn't go back to those tracks again. A couple years later, we moved to Georgia. I was 15 by then and had mostly pushed the Florida incident out of my mind. But one afternoon, I was helping my uncle with some work on his property near a logging area. I was stacking firewood when movement caught my eye at the edge of the clearing. I looked up and saw a large, dark figure standing on two legs just inside the tree line. It was at least 7 feet tall, covered in what looked like matted fur. For a split second, our eyes met. I'll never forget the intelligence I saw in that gaze. It wasn't an animal, but it wasn't human either. Then it turned and melted into the forest faster than anything that size should be able to move. I dropped the log I was holding and ran to tell my uncle, but by the time we got back there was no sign of the creature. He laughed it off, saying I must have seen a bear. but I know what I saw, and it was no bear. The next major incident happened when I was 19. My dad had retired from the Marines by then, and we'd settled in Idaho. I'd gotten really into elk hunting and would often go on solo trips into the backcountry. On this particular trip, I'd hiked several miles into a remote area and set up camp near a small stream. From the moment I arrived, I felt like I was being watched. The hairs on the back of my neck were constantly standing up. I tried to shake it off as nerves from being alone in the wilderness, but the feeling persisted. That night, I barely slept. Every snapping twig or rustling leaf had me on high alert. The next morning, I packed up early and started hiking, eager to get to a new area where I didn't feel so exposed. As I was crossing the stream, I heard splashing upstream. I looked up, expecting to see an elk or maybe a moose. What I saw instead made my blood run cold. Standing in the stream about 50 yards away was a massive hair-covered creature. It was easily 8 feet tall, with long arms that hung below its knees. The face was a mix of ape-like and human-like features, with deep-set eyes that seemed to bore into me. We stared at each other for what felt like an eternity, but was probably only a few seconds. Then it let out a bone-chilling roar that echoed through the valley. I don't remember deciding to run. My body just reacted. I splashed across the stream and took off through the woods, not caring about the direction. I ran until my lungs were burning and my legs were shaking. When I finally stopped to catch my breath, I realized I had no idea where I was. It took me hours to find my way back to my truck, constantly looking over my shoulder and jumping at every sound. I never went back to that area again, and for a long time, I gave up hunting altogether. The final encounter happened just last year. I was driving along the Oregon coast late one night, heading back home after visiting some friends. The road was winding through a heavily forested area, and there was a light fog rolling in from the ocean. I came around a sharp bend, and suddenly there was a figure in the middle of the road. I slammed on the brakes, the tires screeching on the wet pavement. For a split second, I saw it clearly in my headlights. Over 7 feet tall, covered in reddish-brown hair, with a face that was unmistakably not human. It turned its head towards me, eyes reflecting in the light like a deer's would. Then, with incredible speed, it bounded across the road and disappeared into the forest on the other side. The whole thing happened so fast, I wasn't even sure if it was real at first. But the skid marks on the road and the racing of my heart told me it wasn't my imagination. I sat there for a while, trying to process what I'd seen. Part of me wanted to get out and investigate, to find some proof, but a deeper, more primal part of me knew that would be a terrible idea. So I put the car in drive and got out of there as fast as I could. These encounters have left me with more questions than answers. I've done research, read other people's accounts, and even reached out to some Bigfoot research groups. But I still can't explain what I've seen and experienced. All I know is that there's something out there in the woods, something that most people don't believe in, but that I've seen with my own eyes multiple times. I don't expect everyone to believe me. Hell, there are times I have a hard time believing it myself. But I know what I saw, what I heard, and what I felt. And I can't shake the feeling that these creatures, whatever they are out there watching us more often than we realize. I still go camping and hiking, but I'm always on alert now. Every time I'm in the woods, I feel like I'm being watched. Maybe I am. Maybe they're out there right now, just beyond the tree line, observing us as we go about our lives, oblivious to their presence. I don't know if I'll ever have another encounter, or if I even want to. But I do know that these experiences have changed the way I see the world. There are things out there that we can't explain, things that challenge everything we think we know about nature and our place in it. And once you've seen them, you can never go back to seeing the world the same way again. Story 6. I was just a 13-year-old kid living in the Alaskan wilderness back in '75, but I knew there was something out there in those woods, something big. My parents thought I was crazy, always going on about Bigfoot sightings and tracks I'd found, but I knew what I saw. For 2 whole years, I spent every spare moment exploring the forests around our remote cabin, determined to prove Bigfoot was real. That day started like any other expedition. I grabbed my backpack and headed out to dig for worms near the creek. It was early morning, misty and cool. The smell of damp earth and pine needles filled the air as I made my way through the undergrowth. I found a good spot and started digging, lost in my own little world. That's when I heard it, a low, rumbling sound that made the hair on the back of my neck stand up. At first I thought it was just my stomach growling, but then I heard it again, louder this time. It sounded almost like a growl, but deeper and more guttural than any bear I'd ever heard. My heart started racing as I slowly turned around, scanning the tree line. That's when I saw it emerge from the mist. It was enormous, at least 12 feet tall, covered in reddish-brown fur. Its face looked almost human, but not. The eyes were dark and intelligent, set deep under a prominent brow. I froze, unable to move or even breathe. The creature didn't seem aggressive, just curious. It tilted its massive head, studying me intently. I got the sense it was just as surprised to see me as I was to see it. For what felt like an eternity, we just stared at each other. I was trembling, partly from fear, but also from sheer awe. This was it, the moment I'd been waiting for, proof that Bigfoot was real. Suddenly, the creature made a series of low, whooping sounds, almost like it was trying to communicate. The noises echoed through the trees, sending chills down my spine. I wanted to respond somehow, to show I meant no harm, but I was paralyzed. The Bigfoot took a step closer, and that's when my fight-or-flight response finally kicked in. I scrambled backwards, slipping on the damp leaves. The creature didn't pursue me, just watched as I clumsily got to my feet and ran. I sprinted all the way back to the cabin, bursting through the door, gasping for air. My dad looked up from his coffee, alarmed. "Shannon? What happened?" Between gulps of air, I managed to stammer out what I'd seen. To my shock, my dad didn't dismiss me or tell me I was imagining things. He listened intently, asking questions about the creature's appearance and behavior. "I believe you," he said finally. "I've heard stories from the locals about something like that in these woods. Never thought much of it until now." Over the next few weeks, my dad and I combed the area where I'd had the encounter. We found some strange tracks and tufts of reddish fur caught on branches, but no definitive proof. It was maddening. I knew what I'd seen, but we couldn't find anything concrete. That's when I started developing my theory. What if Bigfoot wasn't just an undiscovered primate? What if it had abilities we couldn't explain? The more I thought about it, the more it made sense. Maybe they could create some kind of portal or turn invisible at will. It would explain why no one had ever captured clear footage or found a body. I know it sounds crazy. Hell, sometimes I think I'm crazy. But I can't shake what I saw that day. The intelligence in those eyes, the way it seemed to be trying to communicate. There's something out there in those woods, something beyond our current understanding. I'm 61 now, and I've spent my whole life trying to prove what I saw was real. I've had a few more encounters over the years, fleeting glimpses and strange sounds in the night, but nothing as clear and unmistakable as that first time. Sometimes I wonder if I imagined it all, if maybe I was just a lonely kid with an overactive imagination. But then I remember the fear, the awe, the sheer presence of that creature. It was real. I know it was real. I still live in that same cabin, still explore those same woods. My own kids think I'm a bit obsessed, always going on Bigfoot hunts and setting up trail cams. But I can't let it go. I need to know the truth. Just last week, I was out checking my cameras when I heard that same low, rumbling sound from all those years ago. I froze, heart pounding, as I scanned the trees. For a brief moment, I thought I saw a flash of reddish-brown fur, but as quickly as it appeared, it was gone. Was it real? Was it just my mind playing tricks on me? I don't know anymore. But I'll keep searching, keep hoping for another glimpse of the impossible. Because once you've seen something like that, you can never truly let it go. I know most people won't believe me. Hell, I'm not sure I'd believe me if I hadn't experienced it firsthand. But I swear on everything I hold dear, this is what happened to me, and I'll spend the rest of my days trying to understand it. Some nights, when the wind is howling and the trees are creaking, I swear I can hear those strange whooping calls in the distance. It sends shivers down my spine every time. Part of me wants to run out into the darkness to finally get the proof I've been seeking all these years. But another part of me is scared. What if I find it? What if I don't? I've tried to move on, to forget about it all, but I can't. It's like that creature imprinted itself on my very soul that day. I see its face in my dreams, hear its calls on the wind. It's become a part of me, for better or worse. Sometimes I wonder if it remembers me too, if somewhere out there in the vast Alaskan wilderness, that same creature is telling its own kind about the strange, hairless ape it encountered all those years ago. The thought both thrills and terrifies me. I know I sound like a mad woman, rambling on about Bigfoot and portals, but I swear every word is true. I've spent a lifetime trying to make sense of what happened that day, and I'm no closer to answers now than I was at 13. All I know is that there's more to this world than we can explain. More wonders, more mysteries, more impossible things that we can't even begin to comprehend. And somewhere out there, in the misty forests of Alaska, there's a creature that defies everything we think we know about the natural world. I may never find the proof I'm looking for, but I'll never stop searching, because once you've looked into the eyes of the impossible, you can never truly look away. Story 7. I was 14 years old that summer of 1985, and it's a day I'll never forget as long as I live. My brothers and I were bored out of our minds, as usual during those long, hot Indiana summers. We decided to go for a walk along the old railroad tracks near our house in Fort Wayne, something we'd done 100 times before without incident. It was late afternoon, the sun hanging low and casting long shadows across the tracks. The air was thick and humid, cicadas buzzing incessantly in the trees. We were goofing around, pushing each other and seeing who could balance the longest on the rails without falling off. Just another ordinary day. Until it wasn't. I remember glancing up ahead and seeing what I thought was a big mound of dirt, or maybe a pile of old railroad ties off to the side of the tracks. But something about it seemed off. The shape was all wrong, too rounded and bulky. As we got closer, I squinted, trying to make sense of what I was seeing. That's when it moved. In an instant, that mound of dirt unfolded itself and stood up. My brain couldn't process what my eyes were seeing. It was enormous, at least 8 feet tall, and covered in dark, matted fur. The smell hit me a second later, a pungent, musky odor that made my nose wrinkle. For a split second, we all just stood there, frozen, staring at this thing. It stared right back at us with glinting eyes, set deep in a face that was somehow both ape-like and disturbingly human. Then it moved again, and the spell was broken. With 2 massive strides, it crossed both sets of railroad tracks, a distance that would have taken me at least 6 or 7 steps. The grace and power of its movement was terrifying. One moment it was there, and the next it had vanished down into a ravine on the other side of the tracks. I don't remember deciding to run. One second I was rooted to the spot, and the next I was sprinting back towards home, my brothers right behind me. The sound of our feet pounding on the gravel was deafening in my ears. I kept expecting to feel a huge hand grab me from behind at any moment. We burst through the front door, all of us talking at once, voices high and panicky. Our dad came running, probably thinking we were being chased by a dog or something. When we finally managed to explain what we'd seen, he just shook his head. "Boys, you probably just saw a deer," he said, but I could tell he didn't really believe it. The look in his eyes said he knew this was something else, something he couldn't explain away. But a deer? No way. I'd seen plenty of deer in my life. This was something else entirely, something that shouldn't exist. For weeks afterwards, I had trouble sleeping. Every time I closed my eyes, I saw that thing unfolding itself, rising up to its full, terrifying height. I kept replaying those few seconds over and over, trying to make sense of it. Had we really seen what we thought we saw? My brothers and I talked about it endlessly at first, comparing notes, making sure we all remembered the same details. But as time went on, we mentioned it less and less. It was like some unspoken agreement. We all knew what we'd seen, but talking about it too much made it feel too real, too scary. I started avoiding the railroad tracks after that. Just the sight of them in the distance would make my heart race. I'd get flashes of that creature's eyes, that musky smell. Sometimes at night, I'd wake up in a cold sweat, convinced I'd heard heavy footsteps outside my window. As the years went by, the memory faded a bit, but it never went away completely. I've read about Bigfoot sightings since then, seen sketches and supposed photographs, but nothing ever quite matches what we saw that day. The thing is, I know what we saw was real. It wasn't a bear, it wasn't a man in a suit, and it sure as hell wasn't a deer. It was something other, something that shouldn't exist in our world, but does. I'm 52 now, and I've never seen anything like it again, but I know it's out there. Sometimes when I'm driving past wooded areas, I'll catch myself scanning the tree line, half expecting to see that hulking shape again. I've told this story a few times over the years, usually after a few beers when people are swapping scary stories. Most people laugh it off or try to explain it away, but every once in a while I'll see a flicker of recognition in someone's eyes. They might not say anything, but I can tell. They've seen something too, something they can't explain. I don't know what that creature was or where it came from. I don't know if it's still out there in the forests of Indiana, but I know what I saw that day in August 1985, and no matter how many years pass, I'll never forget the day I came face to face with something that shouldn't exist. Sometimes I wonder if it remembers us too. If somewhere out there in the dark woods, that creature is telling its own story about the day it encountered 3 terrified human boys on the railroad tracks. But then I push that thought away, because the idea of that thing having that level of intelligence is almost more terrifying than the encounter itself. I've gone back to those tracks a few times over the years, always in broad daylight, always with other people. Part of me hopes to see it again, to prove to myself once and for all that it was real. But a bigger part of me hopes I never lay eyes on it again. Because the truth is, once you've seen something like that, you can never unsee it. It changes the way you look at the world. Every shadow in the woods takes on new meaning. Every unexplained sound in the night makes you wonder. I've tried to rationalize it over the years. Maybe it was some kind of escaped exotic animal. Maybe it was a hoax, someone in a very convincing costume. But deep down, I know better. What we saw that day was something that science can't explain, something that shouldn't exist in our world but does. And the scariest part? If that thing is out there, what else might be lurking in the shadows, just out of sight? What other impossible creatures might be watching us from the darkness? I don't have answers to these questions. All I know is what I saw that day on the railroad tracks near Fort Wayne. And no matter how much time passes, no matter how much I try to forget, that memory will always be there, as vivid and terrifying as the day it happened. So, if you're ever out in the woods or walking along some old railroad tracks and you get that prickly feeling on the back of your neck like you're being watched, trust your instincts, because you never know what might be out there, watching and waiting. And if you ever see something you can't explain, something that defies everything you thought you knew about the world, well, just know you're not alone. There are others out there who've seen things too, things we can't explain but know in our hearts are real. As for me, I'll keep telling my story, not to convince anyone, but because I need to, because keeping it inside is harder than letting it out. And maybe, just maybe, by sharing it, I'll find others who've had similar experiences, others who understand that the world is stranger and more mysterious than we could ever imagine. Because once you've seen the impossible with your own eyes, you can never go back to believing the world is simple and easily explained. You carry that knowledge with you always, a secret burden that changes everything. So that's my story. Believe it or don't, that's up to you. But I know what I saw that day, and I'll never forget it as long as I live. Story 8. It was around 2 a.m. when I got the call about an alarm going off at one of the rural properties along my route. Standard procedure, probably just a faulty sensor or maybe a raccoon triggering a motion detector. I flipped on my lights, no siren, didn't want to wake the whole neighborhood, and headed out to check it out. As I pulled up the long gravel driveway, my headlights swept across the overgrown fields on either side. That's when I first noticed some odd movement in the tall grass off to my right. At first I thought it might be a deer or maybe even a bear. We get those around here sometimes. But something about the way it was moving just seemed off. I slowed the cruiser to a crawl, trying to get a better look without spooking whatever it was. As I inched forward, my heart nearly stopped. There, partially obscured by the vegetation but unmistakable in the moonlight, was a massive, hair-covered figure. It had to be at least 6 or 7 feet tall, with broad shoulders and long arms. For a split second, my mind couldn't process what I was seeing. It was like my brain was refusing to accept the reality in front of me. But as I watched, frozen in disbelief, the creature slowly turned its head. I caught a glimpse of a face that was somehow both ape-like and disturbingly human. I've never felt fear like that before. It was primal, instinctual, every cell in my body screaming at me to flee. But I was rooted to the spot, unable to look away. The creature didn't seem aggressive or even particularly interested in me. It just stood there, swaying slightly as it surveyed its surroundings. I noticed leaves and bits of grass tangled in its shaggy coat, like it had been lying in the field. After what felt like an eternity, but was probably only a few seconds, it started to move, not in a rush, but with a deliberate, almost casual gait. It reached up with one long arm and effortlessly pushed aside a branch that was in its way. The casual display of strength sent a chill down my spine. I watched, barely breathing, as it lumbered towards the tree line. Just before it disappeared into the shadows, it paused and looked back over its shoulder. Our eyes met for just a moment, but in that instant, I felt something I can't quite explain. It wasn't just an animal looking at me. There was an intelligence there, a presence. And then it was gone, melting into the darkness of the forest like it had never been there at all. I sat there for a long time, trying to process what I'd just witnessed. Part of me wanted to call it in, to have someone, anyone, come out and verify what I'd seen. But I knew how it would sound. "Hey, dispatch, I just saw Bigfoot out here on Highway 128. Yeah, that would go over well. I've spent my entire career building a reputation as a level-headed, reliable officer. One report like that, and it would all go out the window. I'd be the laughingstock of the department, maybe even lose my job. So I made the decision right then and there to keep it to myself. I did eventually respond to the alarm call, going through the motions of checking the property and resetting the system. but my mind was a million miles away, replaying those surreal moments over and over. In the days and weeks that followed, I found myself constantly scanning the tree line whenever I was on patrol. Every shadow, every rustle in the bushes made me tense up. I started carrying my binoculars in the car, hoping to catch another glimpse of whatever it was I saw that night. I also threw myself into research, spending countless hours online reading about Bigfoot sightings and theories. Some of it seemed pretty far-fetched, but other accounts lined up eerily well with what I'd experienced. The height, the way it moved, even that unsettling intelligence in its eyes, it all matched up. The more I read, the more convinced I became that what I saw that night was real. But that realization brought its own set of problems. How do you go about your daily life knowing that something like that exists out there? How do you not tell anyone, not even your closest friends or family? It's been years now, and I still haven't told a soul. Sometimes I wonder if I imagined the whole thing, if maybe the late night and the moonlight played tricks on my eyes. But then I'll remember the way it looked at me, the unmistakable presence I felt, and I know it was real. I still patrol that stretch of Highway 128, and every time I pass that spot, I can't help but slow down and scan the fields. I've never seen it again, but I know it's out there somewhere. And I can't shake the feeling that maybe, just maybe, it's watching me too. There are nights when I lie awake, debating whether I should come forward with what I saw. But then I think about the ridicule, the potential end of my career, and I stay silent. Sometimes I feel guilty, like I'm keeping an important secret from the world. Other times, I wonder if maybe it's better this way, if some mysteries are meant to remain unsolved. One thing's for sure, I'll never forget that night in September 2007. It changed everything for me, even if no one else knows it. And every time I put on my uniform and badge, I'm reminded that there are things out there beyond our understanding, things that defy explanation. So if you're ever driving down Highway 128 late at night and you see something moving in the shadows, well, maybe it's just the wind. Or maybe, just maybe, you'll catch a glimpse of something extraordinary. Just don't expect anyone to believe you if you do. Story 9. I'll never forget that day in the mountains near David Thompson, Alberta. It's been about 10 years now, but the memory still haunts me. I was just a kid then, maybe 12 or 13, on a camping trip with my family. We'd been coming to this area for years, and I always loved exploring the trails on my bike while my parents set up camp. That afternoon, I decided to ride a bit farther than usual. The weather was perfect, sunny but cool, with a light breeze rustling through the pines. I remember feeling so free and alive as I pedaled along the dirt path, the scent of evergreens filling my lungs. After about 30 minutes, I came to a clearing I'd never seen before. Something about it felt off. The birds had gone quiet, and there was this heavy stillness in the air. I slowed my bike, getting an uneasy feeling in the pit of my stomach. That's when I noticed movement out of the corner of my eye. At first, I thought it was just a shadow or a branch swaying in the wind. But as I turned to look, I saw something partially hidden behind a massive fallen tree trunk about 50 feet away. My heart started racing as I tried to make sense of what I was seeing. It looked almost like a person, but wrong somehow. The proportions were off, and it was covered in dark, matted fur. I froze, gripping my handlebars so tight my knuckles turned white. Part of me wanted to pedal away as fast as I could, but I was paralyzed with fear. Slowly, the thing began to stand up, and up, and up. Oh God, it just kept rising until it was as tall as the surrounding trees. I'll never forget those eyes, deep-set and glowing with an unnatural intelligence. They locked onto mine, and in that moment, I knew with absolute certainty that I was looking at something that shouldn't exist. A primal scream bubbled up in my throat as I finally snapped out of my trance. I jerked my bike around so hard I nearly toppled over. As I started pedaling frantically back the way I'd come, I heard a low, rumbling growl that seemed to vibrate through my entire body. I rode faster than I ever had in my life, branches whipping my face as I tore down the narrow trail. Tears streamed down my cheeks as I gasped for air, certain at any moment I'd feel massive hands grabbing me from behind. When I finally burst into our campsite, I was hysterical. My mum ran over, asking what was wrong, but I could barely form words through my sobs. I just kept saying "monster" over and over. My dad grabbed his rifle and went to check things out, but of course he didn't find anything. They tried to convince me it was just my imagination or maybe a bear, but I knew what I saw. That thing was no bear. It walked on two legs and had an almost human-like face, albeit twisted and feral. In the years since, I've done a lot of research trying to make sense of my experience. The closest thing I've found is accounts of Bigfoot sightings, but even those don't quite match up with what I encountered. I know it sounds crazy. Hell, part of me still wonders if I hallucinated the whole thing. But I swear on my life, what I saw that day was real, and it changed me forever. I haven't been able to go camping since without having panic attacks. Just the thought of being alone in those woods makes my palms sweat and my heart race. Sometimes I dream about it, that moment when our eyes met and I felt the weight of something ancient and terrifying boring into my soul. I wake up drenched in sweat, the echo of that bone-chilling growl ringing in my ears. I've tried talking to a therapist about it, but they always try to rationalize it away or suggest it was some kind of stress-induced hallucination. Maybe they're right. Maybe my mind conjured up some elaborate monster to deal with the normal fears of being alone in the wilderness. But deep down, I know that's not true. There are things out there in this world that defy explanation, things that lurk in the shadows of our so-called civilized existence. I caught a glimpse of one that day, and it shattered my understanding of reality. I've never told many people about this. Who would believe me? But sometimes I wonder how many others have had similar encounters and stayed silent out of fear of ridicule. Are there more of these creatures out there? What are they? Where did they come from? I don't have any answers. All I know is that the mountains of Alberta hold secrets darker and more terrifying than most people could imagine. And somewhere out there, that thing is still roaming free. The rational part of my brain tells me to forget about it and move on with my life. But I can't shake the feeling that someday, somehow, I'll cross paths with it again. And next time, I might not be lucky enough to escape. For now, I stick to the cities and well-populated areas, but every time I see a news story about a hiker gone missing or strange animal attacks in remote regions, I wonder, could it be connected? Are there more of them out there? I try not to dwell on it too much. I've built a good life for myself, with a stable job and a loving partner. But there's always a part of me that remains on edge, waiting for the other shoe to drop. Waiting for that day when I turn a corner and find myself face to face with the impossible once again. If you're reading this and you've had a similar experience, know that you're not alone. And if you haven't, count yourself lucky. But please, be careful out there in the wilderness. There are things in this world beyond our understanding, things that should remain hidden. As for me, I'll keep living my life and trying to forget. But a part of me will always be that terrified kid on a bike, staring into the eyes of a monster and feeling my entire world shift on its axis. Some encounters change you forever, and some mysteries are better left unsolved. Stay safe out there, folks. And if you ever find yourself alone in the mountains and feel that prickle on the back of your neck like you're being watched, don't ignore it. Run. Run as fast as you can and don't look back. Because you never know what might be lurking just out of sight, waiting for the perfect moment to reveal itself. I hope sharing my story helps someone out there feel less alone, or maybe even prevents them from stumbling into a similar situation. If nothing else, it feels good to finally get it off my chest after all these years. Thanks for reading, and remember, the world is a lot stranger and more dangerous than we like to admit. Keep your eyes open and trust your instincts. They might just save your life someday. Story 10. It was late October, and I was on a solo camping trip in the Fremont-Winema National Forest. As a guy with mixed Apache and white heritage, I've always felt a deep connection to nature. My Apache mom instilled in me a reverence for the wilderness and all its creatures. Even though I grew up in rural Texas, the Pacific Northwest had always called to me. That particular evening, I had driven my beat-up old Subaru down a remote Forest Service road, looking for a secluded spot to park for the night. The sun had already set by the time I found a small clearing surrounded by towering ponderosa pines. I grabbed my sleeping bag from the trunk and climbed into the back seat to bed down for the night. The temperature was dropping fast, so I kept my clothes on for extra warmth. I must have dozed off pretty quickly, lulled by the gentle patter of rain on the roof. I'm not sure how long I was out, but I suddenly jolted awake with my heart pounding. You know that feeling when you sense someone watching you? It was like that, but 100 times more intense. Every hair on my body was standing on end. I lay completely still, straining my ears. The rain had stopped, leaving an eerie silence. Then I heard it. A soft, rhythmic breathing coming from right outside the car. Slowly, moving as little as possible, I turned my head toward the rear window. What I saw made my blood run cold. There was an enormous dark figure looming at the back of my car, perfectly still, except for the slight rise and fall of its massive chest. I couldn't make out many details in the darkness, but its sheer size was staggering. It had to be at least 8 feet tall, with incredibly broad shoulders. The head seemed oddly rounded, almost dome-shaped. But it was the eyes that really got to me. 2 faintly glowing orbs, reflecting what little moonlight filtered through the trees. For what felt like an eternity, but was probably less than a minute, we just stared at each other. I was frozen in terror, hardly daring to breathe. A small, detached part of my brain noted the musky, earthy smell wafting through the partially open window. Then, in a motion almost too fluid for something so large, the creature turned and melted into the forest. The entire encounter probably lasted less than a minute, but it felt like hours. I lay there gasping, my mind reeling as I tried to process what I'd just seen. Sleep was out of the question after that. As soon as the first hint of dawn appeared, I was out of that car and examining the area. The ground was soft from the rain, and there in the mud were footprints unlike anything I'd ever seen. They were huge, easily 15 inches long, and showed 5 distinct toes. The stride length between prints was massive, much longer than any human could manage. I snapped a few pictures with shaking hands, though they didn't really do justice to the scale. As the sky lightened, I noticed broken branches high up on some of the surrounding trees, far higher than a person could reach. Something big had passed through here recently. Still rattled, I decided to pack up and head out. But as I was about to leave, something caught my eye. There was a faint trail leading up the forested hillside nearby. On impulse, I decided to follow it. After about 20 minutes of hiking, I came across something that made me stop in my tracks. Tucked into the hillside were several small crescent-shaped cave openings. They were partially obscured by brush, but definitely man-made, or something made. Cautiously, I approached the nearest opening. The hair on the back of my neck stood up as that musky scent from the night before grew stronger. Peering inside, I saw piles of pine boughs arranged almost like a giant nest. There were tufts of coarse, dark hair caught on some of the branches. My hands were shaking as I picked up one of the hairs. It was thick and wiry, about 6 inches long, with a reddish tint in the sunlight. Nothing like human hair or any animal fur I'd ever seen. That's when it really hit me. I might have stumbled onto the den of whatever I'd encountered last night. My heart was pounding as I quickly backed away from the cave. Part of me wanted to investigate further, but a much louder voice in my head was screaming at me to get the hell out of there. I practically ran back down to my car, my mind racing the whole time. What exactly had I seen? The rational part of my brain kept trying to come up with explanations, a bear maybe, or some other known animal. But deep down, I knew this was something else entirely. Growing up in Texas, I'd heard all the Bigfoot stories and always wrote them off as tall tales. But now I wasn't so sure. The size, the footprints, that distinctive smell, it all lined up with the supposed Bigfoot encounters I'd read about. As I drove out of the forest that morning, I was filled with a strange mix of terror and awe. My Apache ancestors believed in creatures beyond human understanding, spirits of the wild that demanded respect. Maybe there was more truth to those old stories than I'd ever imagined. I've gone back and forth 100 times about whether to share this experience. Part of me is afraid people will think I'm crazy or looking for attention, but I know what I saw that night, and I feel like I need to tell someone, even if they don't believe me. I haven't been back to that spot in Klamath County since then. To be honest, I'm not sure I'd have the courage to go back alone, but I often find myself thinking about that creature, wondering if it's still out there in those forests. Sometimes I have nightmares about those glowing eyes staring at me through the car window. Other times I dream about following the beast deeper into the wilderness, learning its secrets. I guess part of me will always be searching for answers about what really happened that night. One thing's for certain, I'll never look at the forests the same way again. There are things out there beyond our understanding, creatures that defy explanation. I only caught a glimpse of one for a few seconds, but it was enough to change my entire worldview. I still love nature and spend as much time outdoors as I can. But now I move through the wilderness with a new sense of reverence and caution. Those forests don't belong to us. We're just visitors in a realm that's home to forces we can barely comprehend. So if you're ever camping in the remote woods of the Pacific Northwest and you feel that prickle on the back of your neck like you're being watched, don't dismiss it. There might be eyes in the darkness, ancient and unknowable, gazing back at you. All we can do is treat the wilderness and its mysteries with respect and hope that respect is returned. I don't know if I'll ever fully understand or come to terms with what I experienced that night in Klamath County, but I do know that it opened my eyes to possibilities I'd never considered before. The world is stranger and more wondrous than we can imagine, and sometimes, if we're lucky or unlucky, we catch a brief glimpse behind the veil. Story 11. We arrived at our campsite late in the afternoon and set up our tents. As the sun began to set, we built a fire and settled in for a relaxing evening under the stars. Jack and Mike were swapping hunting stories while I nursed a beer, enjoying the peaceful sounds of the forest at night. That peace was shattered around 11 p.m. when we heard the first scream. It came from somewhere up in the hills, echoing through the trees. At first, I thought it might be a mountain lion or some other animal. But there was something off about it, too guttural and deep to be any wildlife I was familiar with. We all froze, listening intently. After a minute of tense silence, we heard it again, closer this time. The hair on the back of my neck stood up. Whatever was making that sound was big, and it was moving in our direction. "What the hell is that?" Mike whispered, his eyes wide as he scanned the tree line. Jack shook his head slowly. "I've never heard anything like it. Almost sounds human, but not quite." As an investigator, I prided myself on staying calm under pressure. But in that moment, I felt a primal fear, unlike anything I'd experienced before. My heart was racing as I strained my ears, trying to pinpoint where the creature might be. The screams continued intermittently over the next hour, sometimes farther away, sometimes unnervingly close. We debated packing up and leaving, but none of us wanted to stumble through the dark forest with that thing out there. So we stayed put, huddled around the fire with our hunting rifles close at hand. Around 1 a.m., Jack suddenly stiffened and grabbed my arm. "Do you feel that?" he hissed. "Like we're being watched." I did feel it, an intense sensation of eyes boring into me from the darkness beyond our campfire. The air felt heavy, electrified with tension. Mike was visibly shaking as he gripped his rifle. That's when we saw it, or at least caught a glimpse of it. There was a blur of movement in the underbrush about 50 yards away. Something massive crashed through the foliage, far too big and fast to be human. In the split second I saw it, all I could make out was a dark, hair-covered form, easily 8 feet tall. We all leapt to our feet, shouting in shock and fear. Mike fired off a warning shot, the crack of the rifle impossibly loud in the quiet forest. For a moment, everything went still. Then all hell broke loose. There was a deafening roar from multiple directions, not just one creature, but at least 2 or 3. The sounds of snapping branches and heavy footfalls surrounded us as unseen giants circled our camp. I've never felt so vulnerable and exposed. We were like kids huddling under a blanket, hoping the monsters wouldn't find us. Except these monsters were very real and only feet away in the impenetrable darkness. The next few hours were a nightmare. We couldn't see the creatures clearly, but we caught fleeting glimpses and heard their movements all around us. At one point, a massive branch snapped about 20 feet up a nearby tree. Whatever these things were, they could climb with terrifying agility. And the smell. God, the smell. It hit us in waves, an overpowering stench of wet fur and musk that made my eyes water. It was oppressive, cloying, like nothing I'd ever encountered before. As the night wore on, the creatures seemed to lose interest in us. The sounds grew more distant, the oppressive feeling of being watched gradually faded. When dawn finally broke, we wasted no time breaking camp and getting the hell out of there. The drive back to civilization was silent, each of us lost in our own thoughts. What had we encountered out there in the wilderness? The rational part of my mind wanted to explain it away. A bear, perhaps, or some other known animal. But deep down, I knew we had experienced something far stranger and more terrifying. In the years since, I've researched similar encounters and come to believe we had a run-in with what some call Bigfoot or Sasquatch. I know how that sounds. Before that night I would have laughed at the idea. But after what we saw and heard, I'm convinced these creatures are real. I've never returned to those woods, and I doubt I ever will. The memory of that night still haunts me. The inhuman screams, the feeling of being hunted, the glimpses of something that should not exist. Whatever is out there in the forests of Oregon, it's something beyond our understanding. And frankly, some mysteries are better left unsolved. That camping trip changed me profoundly. I no longer see the world in black and white, but in shades of grey. There are things out there that defy explanation, creatures that lurk just beyond the edge of our reality. I can't prove what we encountered that night, but I know what I experienced. And I'll never forget the terror of realizing we were not alone in those dark woods. Sometimes late at night, I still wake up in a cold sweat, my heart pounding. In those moments between sleep and waking, I swear I can hear those bone-chilling screams echoing in the distance. And I wonder, are they still out there, watching and waiting in the shadows of the forest? I don't have any answers, only questions that will likely never be resolved. All I know is that my perception of reality was shattered that night in Josephine County, and a part of me will always be there in those woods, paralyzed with fear as something inhuman circles our campfire, hidden just beyond the reach of the flickering flames. Story 12. We'd been on the road for hours, the darkness of night settling in around us as we wound through the mountains. The snow was coming down pretty heavy, and Dad decided we should pull over and wait it out rather than risk driving in such treacherous conditions. We were somewhere near Union Creek, Oregon, a tiny speck of a town surrounded by dense forest. Dad pulled off onto a small turnout, the headlights illuminating a wall of softly falling snow. The engine idled as we sat there, listening to the radio and waiting for the weather to clear. I must have dozed off at some point, because the next thing I knew, Dad was shaking me awake, his voice tense. "Son, wake up. Look out there. Do you see that?" I rubbed the sleep from my eyes and peered out into the darkness. At first, I didn't see anything beyond the glow of our headlights. But then, movement caught my eye. Dark shapes, massive and hulking, were moving through the trees at the edge of the turnout. My breath caught in my throat as I counted 10, maybe 12 of them. They were huge, easily 7 feet tall, and they moved with an eerie grace that sent chills down my spine. The way they coordinated their movements reminded me of soldiers or a pack of wolves stalking prey. And in that moment, I realized with sickening clarity that we were the prey. Dad's hand was on the gear shift, ready to throw the car into drive, but he hesitated. "If we move now, we might provoke them," he whispered. "Let's just wait and see what they do." So we sat there, frozen, hardly daring to breathe as we watched these things circle our car. They never fully emerged from the tree line, always staying just at the edge of visibility. But even in the dim light, I could make out details that turned my blood to ice. They were vaguely humanoid in shape, but their proportions were all wrong. Arms too long, shoulders too broad, and they were covered in thick, shaggy hair. In the beam of our headlights, I caught glimpses of faces that were a nightmarish blend of human and ape-like features. Glowing eyes reflected the light, and I swear I saw the flash of sharp teeth in one of their mouths. Minutes stretched into what felt like hours as we sat there, surrounded. I kept expecting them to rush the car at any moment. My heart was pounding so hard I thought it might burst from my chest. Dad's knuckles were white on the steering wheel, and I could see the outline of his pistol pressed against his leg. He always carried when we traveled, but I'd never been so grateful for it as I was in that moment. Suddenly, without warning, one of the creatures let out a bone-chilling howl. It was unlike anything I'd ever heard before. Not quite human, not quite animal. The sound echoed through the mountains, setting off a chorus of howls from the others. "Hang on," Dad growled, throwing the car into drive. The tires spun in the snow for a heart-stopping second before finding purchase. We shot forward, fishtailing slightly as Dad fought to keep control. I twisted in my seat to look behind us, and my blood ran cold. They were chasing us. Those massive, dark shapes were bounding through the snow with inhuman speed, quickly closing the distance. "Faster, Dad!" I yelled, my voice cracking with terror. He didn't respond, just pressed the gas pedal to the floor. The engine roared as we tore down the snow-covered road. I kept my eyes glued to the rear window, watching as those things slowly fell behind. But they didn't give up easily. For miles, I could see them loping after us, their glowing eyes fixed on our tail lights. It wasn't until we hit the main highway that they finally fell out of sight. Dad didn't slow down, though, not for a long time. We drove in tense silence, both of us too shaken to speak. When we finally pulled into a well-lit gas station hours later, Dad turned to me with a grim expression. "Son, what we saw back there, I don't know what it was, but we can't tell anyone. They'll think we're crazy." I nodded, still trembling slightly. "What if they come after us again?" Dad's jaw tightened. "They won't. We're not going back to that area, ever. And we're going to pretend this never happened." But I couldn't pretend. The memory of those creatures haunted my dreams for years. I became obsessed with researching similar encounters, trying to make sense of what we'd seen. It wasn't until years later that I finally got some validation. I was hanging out with my buddy Jake, whose uncle was a retired cop from that area. After a few beers, I finally worked up the courage to tell him about that night. To my shock, Jake didn't laugh or call me crazy. Instead, he got real quiet and said, "You know, my uncle used to tell stories about things in those woods, things that shouldn't exist. Said the department got calls about them sometimes, but they were always told to keep it quiet." That conversation opened the floodgates. I started reaching out to locals in the area, and while most brushed me off, a few had their own stories to tell. Stories of massive, ape-like creatures moving through the forests at night, of livestock going missing and strange tracks found in the snow. I don't know what we saw that night in Union Creek. Maybe it was some unknown species of primate. Maybe it was something else entirely. But I know what I saw, and I know the terror I felt. Sometimes on dark nights when the wind howls outside my window, I still hear those inhuman cries echoing in my mind. And I wonder if somewhere out there, in the deep, dark woods, those creatures are still roaming, still hunting, still waiting for their next unsuspecting prey. Story 13. One night in early October, I was driving back to my small rental apartment after a long day at a job site. It was around 10 p.m. and pitch black out on the lonely stretch of Highway 502. The road wound through dense forest, and I hadn't seen another car for at least 30 minutes. I was tired and looking forward to getting home when I spotted a pair of headlights up ahead. As I got closer, I realized it was a semi-truck pulled over on the shoulder, hazard lights blinking. The cab door was open, and I could see someone moving around outside. At first I debated just driving by. It was late and I was exhausted. But my conscience got the better of me, and I decided to stop and see if the driver needed help. I pulled over about 50 feet behind the truck and got out, grabbing my phone as a flashlight. "Hello?" I called out as I approached. "Everything okay?" As I got closer, I saw a man pacing back and forth near the front of the truck. He was visibly shaken, pale face, wide eyes, trembling hands. When he saw me, he stopped and just stared. "Are you all right?" I asked, growing concerned. "Did you break down?" The man shook his head. I hit something," he stammered. "Something big. I think I killed it." A chill ran down my spine. I shone my light towards the front of the truck and saw a massive dent in the grille. Whatever he'd hit, it wasn't a deer. "Where is it?" I asked, scanning the road with my flashlight. The driver pointed a shaky hand towards the ditch on the opposite side of the highway. "Over there." I dragged it off the road. Heart pounding, I slowly made my way across the road, my light beam bouncing eerily off the trees. As I approached the ditch, I caught a whiff of a strong, musky odor. Then my light fell on something that made my blood run cold. Sprawled in the grass was the largest creature I'd ever seen. It had to be at least 9 feet tall, covered in thick, reddish-brown fur. The body was powerfully built, like a massive gorilla, but the proportions were all wrong. The arms and legs were too long, the torso too narrow, and the face, God, the face. It was disturbingly human-like, with a flattened nose and heavy brow. The eyes were closed, thank God, but the mouth was open in a silent scream, revealing wickedly sharp canine teeth. The truck had clearly struck it in the head. There was a horrific wound where the skull had been partially crushed and nearly severed. Dark, thick blood matted the fur around the injury. I stumbled backwards, my mind reeling. This couldn't be real. It had to be some kind of movie prop or hoax. But the blood, the smell, it was undeniably real. "What the fuck is that thing?" I heard myself say, voice shaking. The truck driver had followed me over. He just shook his head, eyes wide with shock. "I don't know, man. I don't know. I was just driving along and it came out of nowhere, ran right in front of me." I forced myself to look closer, morbid curiosity overcoming my fear. The hands were massive, easily twice the size of a human's, with opposable thumbs and thick claw-like nails. The feet were similar, huge and ape-like, but with an arch like a person's. This was no known animal. It was like something out of a cryptozoology book, a missing link between apes and humans. The implications were staggering. "We need to call someone," I said, fumbling for my phone. "The police, animal control, I don't know." Before I could dial, a pair of headlights appeared on the road, heading our way. The truck driver and I exchanged a nervous glance. Part of me was relieved. Surely whoever it was could help us make sense of this insanity. But another part of me felt a creeping dread. The vehicle slowed as it approached, a large black SUV with tinted windows. It pulled onto the shoulder behind my car and the engine cut off. For a long moment, nothing happened. Then both front doors opened and two men stepped out. They were dressed in plain dark suits, but something about their bearing screamed, "Government agent." One was tall and lean, the other shorter and stockier. Both wore grim expressions as they approached us. "Good evening, gentlemen," the taller one said. His tone was polite but cold. "Having some car trouble?" The truck driver and I glanced at each other, unsure how to respond. These guys couldn't have just happened upon us by chance. I stammered. "There was an accident. We hit something." The shorter agent's eyes flicked to the ditch where the creature lay. "I see. And what exactly did you hit?" I opened my mouth to respond, but no words came out. How could I possibly explain what we'd found? The taller agent sighed. "Let me make this simple. You didn't see anything here tonight. There was no accident. You're both going to get in your vehicles and drive away. Is that clear?" A chill ran through me. "But what about—" I gestured weakly towards the creature. "That's no longer your concern," the agent said firmly. "We'll take care of everything here. You two just need to forget this ever happened." The truck driver nodded quickly, clearly eager to put this all behind him. But I hesitated. This was incredible, potentially world-changing. How could we just walk away? The shorter agent must have sensed my reluctance. He stepped closer, lowering his voice. "Son, I'm going to give you some friendly advice. For your own good, let this go. Forget what you saw here. Go home, go to sleep, and in the morning this will all feel like a bad dream. Trust me, you don't want to get involved in this." There was steel in his eyes, a clear threat behind the words. I swallowed hard and nodded. "Good," the taller agent said. "Now, I'll need your phones, both of you." Wordlessly, we handed them over. The agent tapped at them for a few moments, then handed them back. "You'll find all photos and messages from the last few hours have been deleted. Again, for your own protection. Now, I suggest you gentlemen be on your way. Drive safely." In a daze, I walked back to my car. The truck driver was already climbing into his cab. As I opened my door, I heard a strange whirring sound from the ditch. I turned and saw the agents unfolding some kind of tarp or body bag. They were going to take the creature. I wanted desperately to stay, to demand answers. But the fear and shock of the night finally caught up with me. I got in my car and drove away as fast as I dared. The next morning I woke up hoping it had all been a bizarre nightmare, but the reality quickly sank in. It had happened. I had seen something that powerful people wanted to keep secret. I tried to go about my day normally, but I was a nervous wreck. Every black SUV I saw made me flinch. I kept expecting those agents to show up at my door. That evening, my fears were realized. I had just gotten home from work when there was a sharp knock at my door. I opened it to find the same two agents from the night before. "Mr. Müller," the taller one said, "we need to have a word." They came inside without waiting for an invitation. The shorter one stood by the door, while the other sat across from me at my small kitchen table. "I thought we made ourselves clear last night," he said. "You were to forget what you saw and move on with your life." I swallowed hard. I haven't told anyone, if that's what you're worried about." He nodded. "We know. We've been monitoring your communications, but your continued presence here is a liability we can't afford." My stomach dropped. "What do you mean?" "Your work visa is being revoked, effective immediately. You have 48 hours to leave the country." I stared at him in shock. "You can't do that. I have a job, an apartment." "I assure you, we can and we have," he said coldly. "This isn't a request or a negotiation. You will be on a plane back to Germany in 2 days, or you will face serious consequences. Do I make myself clear?" I nodded numbly, my mind reeling. "Good." He stood up. "A word of advice. Don't try to talk about what you saw here. No one will believe you, and you'll only bring more trouble on yourself. Go home, forget about Canada, and get on with your life." With that, they left as abruptly as they'd arrived. I sat there for a long time, trying to process what had just happened. In the span of 24 hours, my life had been completely upended. I wanted to fight it, to tell someone what had happened. But deep down, I knew it was pointless. Who would believe such an insane story? And clearly these people had the power to make my life very difficult if I didn't comply. So 2 days later, I found myself on a plane back to Germany, my Canadian adventure cut brutally short. I left behind my job, my apartment, and any sense of normalcy. It's been months now, and I still struggle to make sense of what happened that night on Highway 502. Was it really some kind of undiscovered primate? A government experiment gone wrong? Or something even stranger? I'll probably never know the truth, but I'll never forget the sight of that massive, terrifying creature, and I'll always wonder what secrets are hiding in those dark Canadian forests. Story 14. It was supposed to be a fun camping trip with my 7 closest friends. We'd been planning it for months, a chance to get away from the city, disconnect from technology, and enjoy nature. Little did we know the terror that awaited us. We arrived at the campsite late Friday afternoon. It was a secluded spot deep in the forest, far from any trails or roads. As we set up our tents and gathered firewood, there was an excited buzz in the air. We were looking forward to a weekend of hiking, stargazing, and roasting marshmallows around the campfire. That first evening went perfectly. We grilled hot dogs and hamburgers, told ghost stories, and stayed up late into the night talking and laughing. Around 1 a.m. we finally turned in, crawling into our tents with full bellies and high spirits. I drifted off quickly, exhausted from the drive and setup. But sometime in the early hours of the morning, I was jolted awake by a loud thud that shook the ground. Confused and groggy, I sat up and unzipped my tent, peering out into the inky darkness. "Did you guys hear that?" I called out softly. A few mumbled responses came from the other tents. We were all awake now, straining our ears to hear anything unusual. For a few moments, there was only silence. Then another tremendous crash echoed through the woods, followed by the sound of splintering wood. My heart started racing. "What the hell was that?" I heard Jake whisper from the tent next to mine. Before anyone could answer, a blood-curdling scream pierced the night air. It was unlike anything I'd ever heard before, not quite human, not quite animal. The hair on the back of my neck stood up. We scrambled out of our tents, huddling together in the clearing. The faint moonlight barely illuminated our terrified faces. "We need to get out of here," Megan said urgently. But as we turned toward where we'd parked the cars, an ear-splitting roar stopped us in our tracks. It seemed to come from all directions at once, surrounding us. That's when we saw it. At the edge of the clearing, partially hidden behind a massive oak tree, was a shape that made my blood run cold. In the dim light, I could make out a hulking figure, easily 10 or 11 feet tall. It was covered in shaggy fur. a deep reddish-brown color. For a moment, we all stood frozen in shock and disbelief. Then the creature took a lumbering step forward, revealing more of itself. Its face was a nightmarish mix of ape and man, with glowing eyes that seemed to bore right through me. Time seemed to stand still as we stared at this impossible being. In that moment, I knew with absolute certainty that we were face to face with a creature that shouldn't exist. The spell was broken when it let out another bone-chilling roar. We ran. I've never moved so fast in my life. We tore through the woods, stumbling over roots and crashing through underbrush. Branches whipped at our faces and arms. I could hear heavy footsteps pounding the earth behind us, getting closer. Somehow we made it to the cars. We piled in, not even bothering with seatbelts, and peeled out of there as fast as we could. The whole way back to the city, we kept checking the rearview mirrors, terrified we were being followed. We drove straight to Jake's apartment, still in our pajamas, covered in cuts and scratches. For hours, we sat in shocked silence, trying to process what we'd seen. "It had to be a bear," Megan said finally, her voice shaky. "A really big bear on its hind legs." But we all knew that wasn't true. What we saw was no bear. The next day, against our better judgment, we went back to retrieve our abandoned gear. What we found chilled me to the bone. The entire campsite was destroyed. Our tents were shredded, sleeping bags and backpacks torn to pieces. But it was more than just damage from animals or the weather. There was a deliberateness to the destruction that was deeply unsettling. Food had been flung in every direction. Our cooler was crushed flat, as if stepped on by something impossibly heavy. Deep claw marks scored the trees around the clearing. But the most disturbing thing was the boulder. About 15 feet from where we'd been sleeping was an enormous rock, easily 500 pounds, partially embedded in the ground. It hadn't been there the day before. The earth around it was torn up, as if it had been thrown there with incredible force. We gathered what we could salvage in grim silence and got the hell out of there. On the drive home, we swore to each other that we'd never speak of what happened. Who would believe us anyway? But I can't stop thinking about it. Every time I close my eyes, I see that creature's face. I hear that inhuman roar echoing in my dreams. I know what I saw that night. It wasn't a bear or a man in a suit or some elaborate prank. It was something that defies explanation, a monster straight out of legend. Sometimes I try to convince myself it was all just a vivid nightmare. But then I look at the scars on my arms from crashing through the woods that night. I remember the primal terror I felt when that thing emerged from the shadows, and I know it was real. I don't go camping anymore. Hell, I can barely bring myself to walk through the park on a sunny day. The thought of being in the woods again makes me break out in a cold sweat. My friends and I don't talk about it, but I can see it in their eyes when we get together. That shared trauma, that unspoken understanding. We experienced something that night that changed us forever. I'm sharing this now because I need to know if anyone else has had a similar experience. Have you encountered something in the woods that you can't explain? Something that makes you question everything you thought you knew about the world? Because I'm telling you, there are things out there in the dark, things that we're not supposed to see. And once you've seen them, you can never unsee them. That night in Indiana opened my eyes to a terrifying reality, that the monsters from our childhood nightmares might be more real than we ever imagined. And they're out there, waiting in the shadows, ready to shatter our understanding of the world in an instant. I don't know if I'll ever fully recover from what happened. The fear and uncertainty linger, coloring every aspect of my life. But I hope that by sharing this, I can find some small measure of peace. And maybe, just maybe, I'll discover I'm not alone in having glimpsed the impossible. Story 15. I was just a young guy back in '79, fresh out of high school and working at the lumber mill to save up for college. My buddy Jake and I decided to take a fishing trip up to Wabush River before the weather turned cold. We'd been going there since we were kids, so we knew the area pretty well. We drove up on a Friday afternoon in Jake's beat-up Ford pickup, his German Shepherd Rex riding in the back. That dog was one tough SOB. Jake had trained him for protection, and he'd take down a bear if Jake gave the command. We figured having Rex along would keep any unwanted critters away from our camp. We set up our tents right on the riverbank, in this little clearing surrounded by dense forest. As the sun started to set, we got a fire going and cracked open a few beers. The night was crisp and clear, with a bright moon hanging over the treetops. Perfect camping weather. After a few hours of shooting the shit and reliving old times, we turned in for the night. Rex curled up by the dying embers of the fire, alert as always. I drifted off to sleep pretty quick, worn out from the drive and the beers. I'm not sure how long I'd been asleep when I jolted awake to the sound of Rex growling. At first I thought I was dreaming, but then I heard Jake rustling around in his tent. "Rex, what is it, boy?" Jake called out softly. The dog's growl turned into a high-pitched whine. That's when I knew something wasn't right. Rex was trained to stand his ground and bark at any threat. I'd never heard him make a sound like that before. I unzipped my tent and poked my head out. The fire had died down to glowing coals, casting eerie shadows across our campsite. Rex was backed up against Jake's tent, hackles raised, staring intently at the tree line. "Jake, you seeing this?" I whispered. "Yeah," he replied. "What the hell's got into him?" We both crawled out of our tents, trying to spot what had spooked Rex. The forest was dead silent. No crickets, no owls, nothing. Just this oppressive quiet that made the hair on the back of my neck stand up. Suddenly, there was a loud splash from the river. We spun around, expecting to see a fish jumping or maybe a beaver. Instead, a huge rock came hurtling out of the darkness and crashed into the water about 20 feet from shore. "What the fuck?" Jake exclaimed. Before we could even process what was happening, another rock flew past us and smashed into a tree behind our tents. Then another splashed down in the shallows. We dove for cover behind a fallen log, dragging Rex with us. The poor dog was shaking like a leaf, all his training forgotten in the face of whatever was out there. The rocks kept coming, sometimes hitting the water, sometimes thudding into the ground around us. It was like being under artillery fire. We could hear heavy footsteps circling our campsite, always staying just out of sight in the shadows. "We gotta make a run for the truck," Jake whispered urgently. I nodded, my heart pounding so hard I thought it might burst out of my chest. We army crawled towards the path leading back to the logging road where we'd parked. Rex whimpered softly as we tugged him along. We had almost reached the edge of the clearing when the footsteps suddenly stopped. An overwhelming stench hit us, like rotting meat and wet dog combined. I'll never forget that smell as long as I live. Slowly, we turned to look back at our campsite. There, illuminated by the faint moonlight filtering through the trees, stood the most terrifying thing I've ever seen. It was huge, at least 8 feet tall, maybe more. Jet black fur covered its entire body. But it wasn't a bear, or any animal I recognized. It stood on 2 legs, with arms that hung down almost to the ground. Its head was massive, sitting directly on broad shoulders with no real neck. For a moment, we all just froze. Us, Rex, and this thing. Then it let out a roar that shook me to my very core. It was part animal, part human, and entirely horrifying. We scrambled to our feet and ran. I've never moved so fast in my life. We flew down that path, branches whipping our faces, roots threatening to trip us at every step. Rex was right on our heels, no longer the brave guard dog, but just as terrified as we were. I could hear it crashing through the forest behind us, getting closer with every second. The truck seemed miles away. My lungs were on fire, my legs numb, but sheer terror kept me going. Finally, mercifully, we burst out of the trees onto the logging road. Jake fumbled with his keys, dropping them twice before managing to unlock the doors. We piled in, Rex leaping into the bed of the truck. Jake cranked the engine and stomped on the gas before I even had my door closed. The tires spun in the loose gravel before finding purchase. As we fishtailed onto the main road, I looked back. There it stood at the edge of the forest, its massive silhouette framed against the trees. Even from a distance, I could feel its eyes boring into me. Then Jake whipped around a curve, and it was gone from sight. We drove for hours, not stopping until we hit the outskirts of town as the sun was coming up. We pulled into a gas station, both of us shaking so bad we could barely get out of the truck. That's when we noticed the damage. Deep scratches ran along both sides of the truck bed, like something had tried to grab on as we peeled out. The rear bumper was dented and twisted, nearly torn off. Rex was huddled in the corner of the truck bed, still visibly trembling. It took us 20 minutes to coax him out. That dog was never the same after that night, jumped at every shadow, refused to go anywhere near the woods again. We reported what happened to the local rangers, but they just brushed it off as an aggressive black bear. But I know what I saw. That thing was no bear, and no animal I've ever heard of. I've never gone camping again. Hell, I can barely bring myself to go for a hike these days. Whatever that creature was, it's still out there in those woods, and I sure as hell don't want to run into it again. Sometimes I wonder if I imagined the whole thing, but then I remember that roar, that overwhelming sense of terror, and I know it was real. I just wish I knew what it was and why it chose to terrorize us that night. All I know is, there are things out there in the wilderness that defy explanation, things that most people will go their whole lives without encountering, and honestly, they're the lucky ones. Because once you've seen something like that, you can never unsee it. It changes you, deep down in your soul. So if you're ever camping up near Wabush River and you hear rocks splashing in the water at night or smell something foul on the wind, don't investigate. Don't try to be brave. Just get the hell out of there as fast as you can, because you might not be as lucky as we were. Story 16. As I walked, I could hear the crickets chirping and the occasional hoot of an owl. The moon was full, casting an eerie glow over the fields and woods. I've always loved how peaceful it is out here at night, away from the noise and bustle of the bigger towns. But that night, something felt off. I can't explain it, but the hairs on the back of my neck were standing up. I felt like I was being watched. I tried to shake off the feeling, telling myself I was just being paranoid. But then I heard it, a rustling sound coming from the field to my right. At first, I thought it might be a deer or maybe even a coyote. We get those around here sometimes. But when I turned to look, what I saw made my blood run cold. There, moving through the tall grass, was a massive figure. It was hard to make out details in the darkness, but I could see it was easily over 7 feet tall. And it wasn't moving like any animal I've ever seen. It was loping, I guess you'd call it, taking these huge, graceful strides through the field. I froze in place, not daring to move a muscle. My heart was pounding so hard I thought it might burst out of my chest. The creature hadn't seemed to notice me yet, and I prayed it would just keep going. But then it stopped, and slowly it turned its head in my direction. I couldn't see its face clearly, but I could feel its eyes on me. We just stood there, staring at each other for what felt like an eternity, but was probably only a few seconds. Then, faster than I would have thought possible for something that big, it took off, running across the field. I didn't stick around to see where it went. I turned and ran back to my house as fast as my legs could carry me. I locked all the doors and windows and spent the rest of the night huddled in my bed, jumping at every little sound. The next day, I tried to convince myself it had all been a dream, or maybe a trick of the moonlight. But deep down, I knew what I'd seen was real. I didn't tell anyone about it at first. Who would believe me? But then I started hearing whispers around town. Other people had seen things too. One of my neighbors, an older guy who's lived here his whole life, told me he'd seen a huge, ape-like creature near his apple trees one night. Said it was at least 7 or 8 feet tall, with a massive, muscular build. He described it as having a distinctly simian silhouette, but walking upright like a man. Then there was this college kid, home for the summer. He'd been hiking in Morgan State Forest when he came across something on the trail. He said it was like nothing he'd ever seen before. Huge, hairy, and definitely not human. The poor kid was so scared, he fired off several shots from his hunting rifle, but when he went to look for a body, there was nothing there. No blood, no tracks, nothing. These stories got me thinking about what I'd seen that night in the field. Could it be the same creature? And if so, what the hell was it? I've lived in Indiana my whole life, and I've never heard of anything like this before. I started doing some research, looking up local legends and cryptid sightings. That's when I came across stories of Bigfoot sightings in Indiana. I'd always thought Bigfoot was supposed to be in the Pacific Northwest, not here in the Midwest. But the more I read, the more it seemed to fit with what I and others had seen. I became a bit obsessed, I'll admit. I started spending more time outdoors, especially at night, hoping to catch another glimpse of the creature. I bought a better flashlight and even a cheap night vision monocular. My family thought I was losing it, but I couldn't let it go. I had to know if what I'd seen was real. Weeks went by with nothing. I was starting to think maybe I had imagined it all. But then, about a month after my first encounter, it happened again. I was out near the edge of my property, where it borders on a dense patch of woods. It was just after sunset, that time when the light is fading but it's not quite dark yet. I was scanning the tree line with my monocular when I saw movement. At first, I thought it was just a branch swaying in the wind, but then I saw it step out from behind a large oak tree. It was the creature, clear as day. In the fading light, I could make out more details than before. It was covered in thick, dark hair. Its arms were long, hanging down almost to its knees, and its face. God, its face. It was like a bizarre mix of ape and human features, with deep-set eyes that seemed to glow in the twilight. I stood there, paralyzed with a mix of fear and awe. The creature seemed to be foraging, pulling at plants and examining them before putting them in its mouth. It moved with a strange grace for something so large, almost silent despite its size. I don't know how long I watched it. Time seemed to stand still. But eventually it raised its head and looked directly at me. Those eyes. I'll never forget them. They weren't the eyes of an animal. There was intelligence there, and something else I couldn't quite define. Curiosity, maybe? Or was it wariness? We stared at each other for what felt like an eternity. Then, without warning, it turned and moved back into the woods. It didn't run this time, just walked with long, purposeful strides. Within seconds, it had vanished into the shadows of the forest. I stood there for a long time after it was gone, trying to process what I'd seen. Part of me wanted to follow it, to see where it went. But a larger part was terrified of what might happen if I did. In the end, I went back to my house, locked the doors, and tried to make sense of it all. Since that night, I haven't seen the creature again. Sometimes I wonder if it's still out there, watching from the woods. Other times, I try to convince myself it was all just a vivid hallucination. But deep down, I know what I saw was real. I've told a few people about my experiences, but most don't believe me. They think I'm crazy or just making it up for attention. But I know I'm not the only one who's seen something out there. There are others in Larry Batson who have their own stories, their own encounters. I don't know what that creature was. Bigfoot, some unknown species, or something else entirely. All I know is that it's changed the way I see the world. There are things out there we don't understand, things that defy explanation. And sometimes those things are right in our own backyards. I still take walks at night sometimes, but now I always carry a camera with me. I haven't managed to get any clear pictures yet, but I'm hopeful. Maybe one day I'll have proof to show the world. Until then, I'll keep watching the woods and fields around Larry Batson, wondering what other secrets they might be hiding. To anyone reading this who's had a similar experience, know that you're not alone. And to those who haven't, keep an open mind. There's more to this world than we know. And sometimes the truth is stranger than any fiction we could imagine. Story 17. I've been an avid hunter for most of my life, spending countless hours in the woods tracking game and enjoying nature. But nothing could have prepared me for what I encountered last fall in Morgan State Forest. It was a crisp October morning when I set out alone for a day of bow hunting, hoping to bag a nice buck before the season ended. The forest was quiet that day, with just the occasional rustle of leaves in the breeze. As I made my way deeper into a remote section of the woods I rarely visited, something caught my eye that stopped me in my tracks. About 50 yards ahead, partially obscured by some low-hanging branches, was what looked like an enormous bird's nest. But this was no ordinary nest. It was massive, at least 8 feet across, and made of large branches and logs woven together with incredible precision. My curiosity got the better of me, and I cautiously approached to get a closer look. As I neared the strange structure, the hairs on the back of my neck stood up. This was no bird's nest. The branches were far too large and heavy for any bird to manipulate. Some of the logs were easily 4 to 5 inches in diameter. Whatever built this had to be big and strong. I circled the nest slowly, taking in every detail. The construction was remarkably intricate, with smaller twigs and vines woven between the larger branches to create a solid bowl-like shape. But what really sent a chill down my spine was what I saw inside. The interior was lined with clumps of long, coarse hair or fur, far more than you'd expect from any normal forest creature. With trembling hands, I reached out to touch one of the clumps. The hairs were thick and wiry, almost like horsehair but coarser. And there was so much of it, enough to fill several grocery bags at least. My mind raced, trying to make sense of what I was seeing. What kind of animal sheds this much fur, and why collect it in this massive nest structure? I pulled out my phone to take some pictures, but to my frustration found I had no signal this deep in the woods. I debated whether to take a sample of the fur, but something held me back. An uneasy feeling in the pit of my stomach told me I shouldn't disturb anything. I had the distinct sense I was intruding on something I shouldn't be seeing. As fascinating as the discovery was, I couldn't shake the feeling that I needed to get out of there. The forest had gone eerily quiet. No birds, no squirrels, nothing. Just a heavy stillness that felt oppressive. I marked the location on my GPS and hurried back the way I came, constantly looking over my shoulder. That night, I could hardly sleep. The image of that massive nest and the strange fur kept replaying in my mind. I knew I had to go back and document it properly, but I didn't want to go alone this time. The next morning, I called my brother and told him about my discovery. He was skeptical at first, but agreed to come check it out with me that weekend. 5 days later, we hiked out to the spot where I had found the nest. I led the way confidently, following the path I had marked on my GPS. But as we neared the location, confusion set in. The area looked different somehow. Trees I remembered seeing weren't there. Had I made a mistake with the GPS coordinates? We searched the area for over an hour, but there was no sign of the massive nest structure. I was starting to doubt my own sanity. Had I imagined the whole thing? But no, I clearly remembered every detail. It had to be here somewhere. Just as we were about to give up, my brother called out, He had found something. I rushed over, heart pounding. There on the forest floor was a scene of utter destruction. The ground was littered with broken branches and shredded bark, clear signs that something large had violently torn apart a structure. This had to be where the nest was, but there was no trace of the fur I had seen inside. Not a single hair remained. Whatever had built the nest had apparently returned and completely obliterated it, erasing all evidence. A chill ran through me as I realized the immense strength it would take to reduce those thick branches to splinters. My brother and I exchanged uneasy glances. Neither of us wanted to say what we were thinking, but we both knew this wasn't the work of any normal forest animal. Something intelligent and incredibly powerful had deliberately destroyed all traces of its presence here. We took some photos of the destruction and collected a few of the larger branch fragments as evidence. But we didn't linger long. That feeling of being watched had returned, stronger than ever. We made our way out of the forest as quickly as we could, constantly scanning the trees around us. In the weeks since, I've replayed that day over and over in my mind. I've researched known animals in the area, trying to find some rational explanation, but nothing fits. The size and complexity of that nest, the strange fur, the complete destruction days later, it all points to something beyond normal wildlife. I've debated whether to report my experience to the Forestry Service or local authorities, but I know how crazy it sounds, and part of me is afraid of what might happen if I start asking too many questions. So for now, I've kept it to myself, sharing anonymously online in hopes that someone else might have seen something similar. All I know is that I'll never look at those woods the same way again. Something is out there, something intelligent, powerful, and determined to remain hidden. I still go hunting, but never alone anymore. And I'm always watching the trees, wondering if I'll catch a glimpse of whatever it was that built that massive, fur-filled nest in the depths of Morgan State Forest. The experience has left me with so many unanswered questions. What kind of creature could construct something so large and intricate? Why collect all that fur, only to destroy everything days later? Was it some kind of territorial marking or mating ritual? Or was it aware that it had been discovered and deliberately erased the evidence? I've spent countless hours researching cryptid sightings and unexplained phenomena in the area, hoping to find some clue. But nothing quite matches what I saw. The closest I've found are some vague reports of nests associated with Bigfoot sightings, but even those don't describe anything on this scale. The more I think about it, the more convinced I become that whatever built that nest was not just some undiscovered animal. The level of intelligence and deliberate action required suggests something far more complex, something that doesn't want to be found. I've gone back to that area of the forest a few times since, always with a companion, but I've never seen any sign of the nest or its builder. It's as if it never existed. Sometimes I wonder if I imagined the whole thing. But then I look at the photos of the destruction we found, and I know it was real. The experience has changed me. I'm more cautious in the woods now, always alert for anything out of place. Every snapped twig or rustling bush makes me jump. I can't shake the feeling that I'm being watched, even in areas I've hunted for years without incident. I've thought about setting up trail cameras in that part of the forest, trying to catch evidence of whatever is out there. But something always holds me back. Maybe it's fear of what I might see. Or maybe it's a deeper instinct telling me that some things are better left undiscovered. For now, I'm left with nothing but questions and a lingering sense of unease. I know there's something out there in Morgan State Forest. Something big, intelligent, and very good at hiding. And I can't help but wonder, if I found one nest, how many more might be out there, hidden in the depths of the forest, and what might happen if someone else stumbles upon one. I don't have any answers, but I know I'll never forget that massive, fur-filled nest and the chilling scene of destruction that followed. Whatever is out there, it's clear it wants to remain a mystery, and after what I've seen, I'm inclined to let it stay that way. Story 18. We had set up our tents in a secluded spot, surrounded by towering trees and the sounds of nature. As night fell, the forest came alive with chirping crickets and the occasional hoot of an owl. I snuggled into my sleeping bag, feeling safe and cozy despite being in the wilderness. I'm not sure how long I had been asleep when I was jolted awake by a strange sound. At first, I thought it was just the wind rustling the leaves, but then I heard it again, a deep, rumbling breath right outside our tent. My heart started racing as I realized there was something out there, something big. I lay perfectly still, afraid to make even the slightest movement. The breathing continued, slow and steady. Then I caught a whiff of a musty, animal-like odor seeping through the tent fabric. My mind immediately went to bears. We had been warned about them, told to keep our food locked up tight. But this smell was different, more pungent and wild. The creature, whatever it was, seemed to be circling our tent. I could hear the soft crunch of leaves under its feet as it moved. My eyes were wide open in the darkness, straining to see any hint of a shadow through the thin nylon walls. Suddenly, there was a light brush against the side of the tent, as if something had grazed it in passing. I let out an involuntary gasp, then immediately regretted it. The breathing stopped abruptly. For a long moment, there was complete silence. Then, to my horror, I felt something press against the tent wall near my head. It wasn't a paw or a snout like I would expect from a bear. It felt larger, almost like a hand. Panic overwhelmed me, and without thinking, I reached out and grabbed at whatever was on the other side of the fabric. What I felt defied explanation. It wasn't fur or rough hide. The texture was oddly smooth yet leathery, and the proportions were all wrong. My hand could barely wrap around what I can only describe as a massive wrist or forearm. As I gripped it in terror, I felt the muscles beneath the skin flex and tense. A low, guttural sound rumbled from the creature, not quite a growl, but almost like a surprised grunt. I let go immediately, my hand recoiling as if I'd touched a hot stove. There was a quick rustling, and I sensed the thing moving away from the tent. I lay there, my heart pounding so hard I thought it might burst out of my chest. I wanted to scream, to call out to my parents in the next tent over, but my voice was trapped in my throat. All I could do was listen as heavy footsteps retreated into the forest, accompanied by the occasional snap of a branch. When morning finally came, I was still wide awake, huddled in my sleeping bag. I half expected to unzip the tent and find massive footprints or some other evidence of the nighttime visitor. But there was nothing. No tracks, no broken branches, not even a scuff mark on the tent where I had felt the creature. At breakfast, I tried to bring up what had happened, but the words wouldn't come. My parents were chatting about our plans for the day, completely oblivious to the terror I had experienced. Maybe it was shock, or maybe I was afraid they wouldn't believe me, but I couldn't bring myself to tell them. As we packed up camp, I kept replaying the encounter in my mind. The breathing, the smell, the feel of that strange skin under my hand. It all seemed impossible in the light of day. But I knew it wasn't a dream. It was too vivid, too real. For weeks afterward, I had trouble sleeping. Every time I closed my eyes, I was back in that tent, feeling the presence of something unknown lurking just outside. The sound of the creature's body sliding against the tent fabric was seared into my memory. I found myself obsessively trying to recreate it, dragging various objects across different surfaces until I found something that matched. The smooth plastic of a flashlight drawn slowly across nylon came closest. As time passed, I tried to rationalize what had happened. Maybe it was a bear, and my terrified mind had simply distorted the experience. But deep down, I knew that wasn't true. Whatever I encountered that night was something different, something that shouldn't exist. I've spent years researching, trying to find any similar accounts or explanations for what I experienced. I've read about Bigfoot sightings and other cryptid encounters, but nothing quite matches what I felt that night. The proportions were just wrong. Not like any animal I know of, and certainly not human. Sometimes I wonder if I imagined the whole thing, if it was just an elaborate nightmare brought on by the stress of camping in an unfamiliar place. But then I remember the feel of that leathery skin, the flecks of muscles beneath my grip, and I know it was real. I've never gone camping since that trip. The thought of sleeping in a tent, vulnerable to whatever might be lurking in the darkness, fills me with dread. Even now, nearly 2 decades later, I still sometimes wake up in a cold sweat, convinced I can hear that deep, rumbling breath just outside my bedroom window. I don't know what it was that visited our campsite that night in Yosemite. I don't know if it meant us harm or was simply curious. But I do know that it changed me forever. It opened my eyes to the possibility that there are things in this world that we can't explain, things that lurk just beyond the edge of what we understand. Sometimes I think about going back to Yosemite, to that same spot where we camped illegally all those years ago. Part of me wants answers, wants to prove to myself that it really happened, but a larger part of me is terrified of what I might find. What if it's still out there, waiting in the shadows? I've never told anyone this story before. It feels both liberating and terrifying to finally put it into words. I don't expect anyone to believe me. Hell, there are days I'm not sure I believe it myself. But I know what I experienced that night was real, and it's a memory that will stay with me for the rest of my life. To this day, I can't shake the feeling that I brushed up against something that wasn't meant to be seen or touched by human hands. Something ancient and unknown, a creature that exists in the spaces between what we know and what we fear. And sometimes in the darkest hours of the night, I swear I can still hear that deep, rumbling breath, and I wonder if it remembers me too. Story 19. I was just 13 that summer, hanging out with my buddies near the old railroad tracks like we always did. It was late August, hot as hell in Alabama, and we were messing around doing stupid kid stuff to pass the time before school started up again. We had this rope swing we'd set up over a creek, but I realized I'd left the rope tied to a tree further down the tracks. I told the guys I'd go grab it real quick. It was only about a quarter mile away, so I didn't think much of it. As I was walking along the tracks, I started to get this weird feeling. You know that prickly sensation on the back of your neck, like someone's watching you? It was like that, but worse. I kept looking over my shoulder, but I didn't see anything. Just the thick woods on either side of the tracks. I tried to shake it off, figuring I was just being paranoid. But then I heard it, this rustling sound coming from the trees to my right. At first I thought it was probably just a deer or something, but it sounded bigger, and it seemed to be keeping pace with me as I walked. I stopped for a second, and the rustling stopped too. That's when I really started to freak out. I called out, thinking maybe it was one of my friends trying to scare me. "Hey, cut it out, guys! This isn't funny!" No answer, just this eerie silence. I started walking again, faster this time. The rustling picked up too, definitely matching my pace. Whatever it was big. I could hear branches snapping as it moved. My heart was pounding so hard I could hear it in my ears. I was almost running at this point, desperate to get to that damn rope and get back to my friends. The thing in the woods was definitely running too now, crashing through the underbrush. I reached the tree where we'd left the rope and frantically started untying it. My hands were shaking so bad I could barely work the knot. I kept glancing over at the tree line, expecting to see something burst out at any second. That's when I saw it. just for a split second, but I'm sure of what I saw. This massive, dark shape, easily 7 or 8 feet tall, just beyond the first row of trees. It was only visible for a moment before it stepped back into the shadows. But in that brief glimpse, I saw matted hair covering its body and these huge, inhuman eyes reflecting the sunlight. I nearly pissed myself right there. I abandoned the rope and just took off running back towards my friends. I could hear it crashing through the woods parallel to the tracks, keeping up with me easily despite my adrenaline-fueled sprint. In desperation, I grabbed a thick branch off the ground as I ran. When I got to a small clearing, I turned and hurled it as hard as I could into the trees where I thought the thing was. What happened next still gives me nightmares. There was this horrific, guttural roar, louder than anything I've ever heard. It wasn't human, and it sure as hell wasn't any kind of animal I knew of. The woods exploded with noise as trees started snapping and breaking. It sounded like a freight train plowing through the forest. I ran harder than I've ever run in my life. Branches whipped my face and arms as I tore through the woods, not even caring about the tracks anymore. I just needed to get away from that thing. When I finally burst out of the tree line near where my friends were, I was drenched in sweat, bleeding from dozens of scratches, and shaking uncontrollably. I crashed right into my buddy Mike, and we both went down in a heap. They all started laughing at first, thinking I was playing some kind of joke. But when they saw the look on my face and my bleeding arms, they shut up quick. I tried to explain what happened between gasping breaths, but I was borderline hysterical at that point. We all went dead silent when we heard another roar in the distance, followed by the sound of more trees being destroyed. My friend's eyes went wide with fear. Nobody was laughing anymore. We took off running towards town and didn't stop until we reached Mike's house. We piled inside and locked all the doors and windows. I was still shaking so bad I could barely stand. Mike's mom found us huddled in the living room and demanded to know what was going on. We tried to explain, but it all sounded so insane. She clearly thought we were making it up or were on drugs or something. I called my parents to come pick me up. I couldn't stop looking out the windows, terrified I'd see that thing emerge from the woods at the edge of the yard. When my dad arrived, I ran to the car and locked the door as soon as I got in. On the drive home, I tried to tell him what happened. He listened patiently, but I could tell he didn't believe me. He said something about an overactive imagination and too many scary movies, but he hadn't seen what I saw. He hadn't heard that ungodly roar, or the sound of full-grown trees being snapped like twigs. That night, I barely slept. Every little noise outside my window made me jump. I kept replaying that glimpse of the creature in my mind. Those eyes. They weren't animal eyes. There was an intelligence there, something almost human, but twisted, primal. The next day, my friends and I went back to the area with Mike's older brother. We wanted to show him the damage, to prove we weren't making it up. But when we got there, we couldn't find any sign of the destruction I'd heard. No broken trees, no huge footprints, nothing. My friends started to doubt my story. They said maybe I'd just panicked and imagined it all. But I know what I saw, what I heard. That thing was real, and it was unlike anything that's supposed to exist. In the weeks that followed, I became obsessed with researching similar encounters. I found stories from all over the country of people seeing massive, ape-like creatures in the woods. Some called it Bigfoot or Sasquatch. In the South, a lot of people called it the skunk ape. The details varied, but so many of the stories lined up with what I experienced. The inhuman speed and strength, the terrifying roar, the intelligence in its eyes. I know now that I'm not crazy, that there really are things out there in the woods that science can't explain. I'm 43 now, and I've never gone back to those train tracks. I avoid going into the woods altogether if I can help it. Some of my friends still bring up that day as a joke sometimes. The day Jerry lost his mind and thought he saw Bigfoot. but they don't know. They didn't see what I saw. I still have nightmares about those eyes staring at me from the shadows, about that roar that shook me to my core. I don't know what that creature was or if it's still out there, but I know it was real. And I know that there are things in this world that we don't understand, things that maybe we're not meant to understand. So if you're ever out in the woods and you get that feeling of being watched, if you hear something big moving through the trees, keeping pace with you, don't stop. Don't throw anything at it. Just run. Run as fast as you can and don't look back, because you never know what might be lurking in the shadows, just waiting for its chance to reveal itself. Story 20. My blood ran cold, and I instinctively moved closer to my uncle. He had gone completely still, his eyes scanning the darkness beyond our campsite. After a long moment of tense silence, he spoke in a low voice. That was a Sasquatch. I wanted to laugh it off, to tell myself he was just trying to scare us with another tall tale, but the grave look on his weathered face told me he was dead serious. That night I barely slept a wink, jumping at every snapping twig or rustle of leaves. Years passed, and I mostly forgot about that unsettling experience. Life went on. I got married, had a daughter, built a career. But then came the camping trip to Shaver Lake that changed everything. My daughter was about 12 at the time, full of energy and curiosity about the outdoors. We had been having a great time hiking and exploring. On our third night there, we were settling in around the campfire when we heard it, that same chilling, otherworldly scream from all those years ago. My daughter's eyes went wide with fear, and I felt my heart pounding in my chest. "What was that, Mom?" she whispered. I didn't know how to answer. Part of me wanted to pack up and leave right then and there, but I told myself I was being silly, that it was probably just some animal we weren't familiar with. We went to bed soon after, but I lay awake for hours, straining my ears for any unusual sounds. The next morning, my daughter begged to go on another hike. Against my better judgment, I agreed. We set off down one of the trails, chatting and enjoying the beautiful scenery. About a mile in, we came to a small clearing. What we saw there made my blood run cold. There, pressed into the soft dirt, was a set of footprints. But these were no ordinary tracks. They were massive, easily twice the size of my own foot. The impression was deep, as if made by something incredibly heavy. My daughter and I just stood there in shocked silence, trying to make sense of what we were seeing. As we continued our hike, now much more wary of our surroundings, a horrid stench suddenly assaulted our nostrils. It was an overpowering mix of rotting meat and wet dog, so strong it made my eyes water. We rounded a bend in the trail and came upon a disturbing sight, a perfect circle of trees, in the center of which was an enormous pile of feces. I'm talking unnaturally large, like nothing I'd ever seen before. My instincts were screaming at me to get out of there. I grabbed my daughter's hand and we started quickly making our way back toward our campsite. That's when we heard it, a series of loud whoops echoing through the forest. It sounded like they were coming from multiple directions, as if we were being surrounded. We broke into a run, stumbling over roots and rocks in our panic. Those eerie whooping calls seemed to follow us the whole way back. By the time we reached our tent, we were both out of breath and trembling. We packed up our gear in record time and got the hell out of there, barely speaking during the long drive home. I tried to rationalize what had happened, to convince myself there must be some logical explanation. But deep down, I knew we had encountered something beyond the ordinary that day. Life has a way of moving on, though. A few years later, I got divorced and decided I needed a fresh start. I moved across the country to a rural property in Michigan, hoping to find some peace and quiet. For a while, things were great. I loved the solitude and natural beauty of my new home. But then, the strange occurrences started up again. It began with unfamiliar sounds in the woods at night. Not quite the screams from before, but deep, guttural noises that made the hair on the back of my neck stand up. I'd wake up some mornings to find odd markings on the hiking trails that crisscrossed my property, broken branches way too high up for a person to reach, strange symbols carved into tree bark. One evening, as dusk was falling, I was out in the garden when I felt like I was being watched. I scanned the tree line and could have sworn I saw something large moving in the shadows, a flash of reddish-brown fur, far too big to be a bear. I ran inside and locked the doors, my heart racing. These encounters continued sporadically over the next few months. Sometimes it was just a feeling of being observed, other times more concrete evidence like those massive footprints or inexplicable damage to the chicken coop. I never got a clear look at whatever was out there, but the feeling of a presence was undeniable. I started researching, trying to find some explanation for what was happening. That's when I stumbled across accounts from others who had experienced similar things, stories of Bigfoot encounters from all over the country. So many details matched up with my own experiences that it sent chills down my spine. I've gone back and forth countless times, questioning my own sanity, looking for any other possible explanation. But I know what I've seen and heard. There's something out there in the woods, something that defies conventional understanding. I don't talk about it much. Most people would think I was crazy if I tried to explain. But I know I'm not alone in having encountered these beings. Whatever they are, Bigfoot, Sasquatch, some unknown species, they're real. And they're out there, watching from the shadows of the forest. These days, I've reached an uneasy truce with my unseen neighbors. I respect their territory, and they seem to keep their distance. But I never go into the woods unarmed, and I'm always alert for any signs of their presence. The encounters have died down lately, but I can't shake the feeling that they're still out there, just beyond the edge of the trees, waiting and watching. I don't know if I'll ever fully understand what I've experienced over the years. Part of me still hopes for some concrete proof, some way to validate what I know to be true. But another part of me wonders if these creatures are meant to remain a mystery, a reminder that there are still things in this world beyond our comprehension. All I know for certain is that my experiences have forever changed the way I view the world around me. The line between the known and unknown is far blurrier than most people realize, and sometimes, when I'm outside at twilight and catch a whiff of that unmistakable musky odor on the breeze, I'm reminded that we may not be alone in these woods after all. Story 21. I still remember that day like it was yesterday, even though it's been over 20 years now. My family had just moved to a small town in Arizona where my parents bought a 25-acre property to start a small farm. I was only 3 years old at the time, but that encounter left such a vivid imprint on my mind that I can recall every detail with crystal clarity. It was a warm spring afternoon, and my parents were busy tending to the vegetable garden near our modest farmhouse. Being the curious toddler I was, I wandered off to explore our vast backyard, which was mostly open fields with patches of trees here and there. The sun was starting to dip lower in the sky, casting long shadows across the land. As I wandered further from the house, I noticed something odd in the distance. At first, I thought it was just a large tree stump, or maybe a pile of rocks. But as I got closer, I realized it was moving slightly. My young mind couldn't quite process what I was seeing, but I felt a mix of curiosity and unease. I took a few more steps forward, and that's when I saw it clearly. Sitting on our wooden fence about 50 yards away was what I can only describe as a big monkey. But it wasn't like any monkey I'd ever seen in picture books or on TV. This creature was massive, easily 7 or 8 feet tall, even in its hunched sitting position. Its body was covered in thick, dark brown fur that seemed to shimmer slightly in the fading sunlight. What struck me most were its eyes. They were deep-set and intelligent, a rich amber color that seemed to glow with an inner light. and they were staring directly at me. There was no aggression in its gaze, just an intense curiosity that mirrored my own. For what felt like an eternity, but was probably only a few seconds, we just stared at each other. I remember feeling a strange sense of wonder and connection, like I was witnessing something truly extraordinary. But then, as if a spell had been broken, a primal fear gripped my little heart. I started backing away slowly, my eyes never leaving the creature's face. Suddenly, it shifted its position on the fence, and that was enough to send me into a panic. I turned and ran as fast as my little legs could carry me, screaming for my parents. I could hear the sound of heavy footsteps behind me, but I didn't dare look back. My heart was pounding so hard I thought it might burst out of my chest. I reached my parents, breathless and terrified. Between sobs, I tried to explain what I had seen, but my limited vocabulary made it difficult. All I could manage was big monkey and scary. My parents, naturally concerned, scanned the area, but saw nothing unusual. My father, thinking I had just let my imagination run wild, tried to calm me down and assured me there were no monkeys in Arizona. For the next few days, I was too scared to venture far from the house. Every time I looked towards that part of our property, I half expected to see the creature again. But life went on, and slowly, the intensity of the memory began to fade. That is, until about a month later. We were watching TV one evening when a documentary about unexplained phenomena came on. As they started talking about Bigfoot sightings, they showed a sketch of the creature. I immediately pointed at the screen and exclaimed, "That's the big monkey I saw." My parents were stunned. The resemblance between what I had described and the Bigfoot illustration was uncanny. My father, who had been skeptical before, now looked at me with a mix of concern and bewilderment. He asked me to describe again what I had seen that day, and this time, with the help of the image on TV, I was able to provide more details. I told them about the creature's massive size, its brown fur, and those haunting amber eyes. I described how it had been sitting on our fence, just watching me. As I spoke, I could see the color draining from my parents' faces. They realized that my encounter might have been more than just a child's overactive imagination. My grandmother, who was visiting at the time, took a particular interest in my story. She had always been fascinated by folklore and unexplained phenomena. Over the next few days, she gently questioned me about the encounter, careful not to lead me or put words in my mouth. She seemed to believe me without question, which was a relief after feeling like no one had taken me seriously. One afternoon, my grandmother took me for a walk around the property. As we approached the area where I had seen the creature, I felt a chill run down my spine despite the warm weather. My grandmother must have sensed my unease because she squeezed my hand reassuringly. "Can you show me exactly where you saw it?" she asked gently. I pointed to the old wooden fence, which suddenly seemed much more ominous than before. "It was sitting right there," I said, my voice barely above a whisper. My grandmother nodded thoughtfully and approached the fence. She examined it closely, running her hand along the weathered wood. Suddenly, she called me over, her voice filled with excitement. "Look at this," she said, pointing to something on the fence post. As I got closer, I saw what had caught her attention. Embedded in the wood were several long, coarse hairs. They were dark brown, almost black, and unlike anything I had ever seen before. My grandmother carefully plucked one and held it up to the light. "This is not from any animal I know," she murmured, more to herself than to me. That discovery seemed to validate my experience in a way nothing else had. My grandmother took the hair home with her, promising to have it analyzed. But before she could, something strange happened. The hair disappeared from the sealed envelope she had placed it in, almost as if it had never existed. In the years that followed, I often thought about that encounter. As I grew older, I researched Bigfoot sightings and found that my experience shared many similarities with other reports. The location, the creature's behavior, its appearance, it all fit the pattern. But what stuck with me most was the feeling I had in those moments before fear took over. There was a connection, a sense of mutual curiosity and wonder. It wasn't a monster I saw that day, but a being, intelligent and aware. I never saw the creature again, despite spending many more years on that property. But I know what I saw, and the memory of those amber eyes staring into mine has stayed with me all these years. To this day, I can't explain what happened. Was it really Bigfoot, some unknown species, or just an elaborate trick of light and shadow combined with a child's vivid imagination? I don't have the answers, but I know that experience changed me. It opened my eyes to the possibility that there's more to this world than we understand, that there are still mysteries out there waiting to be discovered. Sometimes, when I'm out in nature, I find myself scanning the tree line, half hoping and half fearing that I'll catch a glimpse of that big monkey again. And every time I see a fence in a remote area, I can't help but wonder if something extraordinary might be sitting there, watching and waiting, just as curious about us as we are about it. Story 22. I've never been one to believe in the supernatural or unexplained phenomena. As a cattle rancher in rural Arizona, I've always prided myself on being a pragmatic, level-headed guy. But after what happened on my property last month, I'm not so sure anymore. I can't shake the feeling that something truly bizarre and terrifying is out there. It all started innocently enough. I noticed a few of my chickens had gone missing from the coop. At first I assumed it was just coyotes or maybe a hawk, nothing too out of the ordinary. But then more animals started disappearing without a trace, rabbits from their hutches, even a couple of young calves. There were never any signs of struggle, no blood, no tracks. They would just vanish into thin air. I started locking up the animals more securely at night and set up some trail cameras around the property. But the disappearances continued, and the cameras never caught anything. It was like the animals were just blinking out of existence. Things took an even stranger turn about 2 weeks in. I had this old pot-bellied pig named Wilbur that I kept as a sort of pet. He was getting on in years, and I found him dead one morning in his pen. Nothing suspicious about that. He was old and had been in declining health. I decided to leave the body out overnight to see if whatever was taking my animals would go for it. I set up extra cameras around the pig pen, feeling certain I'd finally catch the culprit in the act. The next morning, I went out to check, and my blood ran cold. The entire pig carcass was gone without a trace. No drag marks, no blood, no scattered bones. The cameras showed absolutely nothing. It was there one frame and gone the next. I'm talking about a 200-pound pig just vanishing into thin air. I've never seen anything like it in all my years of ranching. At that point, I was seriously freaked out. I called the sheriff's office, but they just blew me off, saying it was probably coyotes or mountain lions. But I knew better. No normal predator could make a huge pig carcass disappear so completely without leaving any evidence behind. I started doing nightly patrols of my property, armed with my rifle and a powerful flashlight. For several nights, nothing happened. But then came the night that still gives me chills to think about. It was around 2 a.m., and I was making my usual rounds. The night was eerily still and quiet. No wind, no sounds of wildlife. Just dead silence. I was near the back of my property, close to where it borders national forest land, when I heard it. Footsteps, but not animal footsteps. These were clearly bipedal. The rhythm was all wrong for a bear or mountain lion. My heart started racing, and I swung my flashlight beam toward the sound. For a split second, I caught a glimpse of something. A dark figure, unnaturally tall and broad-shouldered, with an oddly shaped conical head. It was only visible for a moment before it seemed to melt into the shadows. I called out, my voice shaking, "Who's there? This is private property." No response, just more of those heavy footsteps circling around me. I fired a warning shot into the air, which seemed to startle whatever it was. I heard rapid footsteps retreating into the woods, but they sounded off, like the stride was much longer than a normal human's. I practically ran back to my house and locked all the doors, my hands trembling so bad I could barely turn the key. I didn't sleep at all that night, just sat up with my gun, jumping at every little sound. The next day, I went back out to where I'd seen the figure, looking for tracks or any sign of what I'd encountered. The ground was hard and rocky, but I did find a few odd impressions. They were huge, easily 20 inches long, and deeper than any human footprint I've ever seen. It was like whatever made them weighed hundreds of pounds. I also noticed some of the underbrush looked trampled, with branches snapped off unusually high up. Some of the breakage was a good 8 feet off the ground. Whatever did this was big. Over the next few days, the animal disappearances continued. I lost 3 more calves and a bunch of chickens. I was at my wits' end, not knowing what to do. I thought about selling the ranch and moving, but who would buy a place with unexplained animal disappearances? Then came the night that pushed me over the edge. I was awakened around midnight by the sound of my dogs going absolutely berserk outside. I grabbed my gun and flashlight and ran out onto the porch. The dogs were in a frenzy, barking and growling at something in the darkness beyond the reach of the porch light. I shone my flashlight out into the yard and felt the blood drain from my face. There, at the edge of the light, was the creature. It was even bigger than I'd thought, easily 8 feet tall and massively built. Its body was covered in dark, matted fur, but it was the face that haunts me. It had deep-set eyes that reflected red in my flashlight beam, a flat, ape-like nose, and a mouth full of sharp teeth frozen in a grimace. For a moment, we just stared at each other. Then it let out a roar that shook me to my core, not quite animal, not quite human. My dogs went silent and ran whimpering under the porch. The creature turned and loped off into the darkness with incredible speed for something so large. I stood there trembling for I don't know how long, unable to process what I'd just seen. When I finally worked up the courage to go investigate, I found massive footprints in the dirt of my yard. But strangest of all was a tuft of coarse reddish-brown hair caught on the barbed wire fence. I collected it in a plastic bag, my mind reeling. The next day, I drove into town and went straight to the sheriff's office. I showed them the hair sample and plaster casts I'd made of the footprints. They just laughed it off, saying I'd obviously faked it all, called me a kook and said to stop wasting their time. I was furious and desperate. I knew what I'd seen was real. In a last-ditch effort, I sent the hair sample to a lab for DNA testing. The results came back inconclusive. They said it didn't match any known species, but that the DNA was structured similarly to primates. It's been a few weeks now since my last encounter. The animal disappearances have stopped, at least for now, but I can't shake the feeling that it's still out there, watching and waiting. I've beefed up security on my ranch, installed more lights, reinforced the fences and animal pens, but I know deep down that if it wants to come back, no fence will keep it out. I don't know what to do. No one believes me. I sound crazy even to myself when I try to explain it. But I know what I saw. There's something out there in the Arizona wilderness that science can't explain. Something that's both terrifyingly animal and unnervingly intelligent. I'm sharing my story in the hopes that someone out there has experienced something similar, that I'm not alone in this. Because the alternative, that I'm losing my mind, is almost as scary as the creature itself. All I know is that I'll never look at the forests around my property the same way again. And on dark nights when the wind is still, I swear I can hear those heavy footsteps circling my house, waiting. Story 23. We arrived at the campsite on a Friday afternoon in early May 2010. The weather was perfect, warm but not hot, with a gentle breeze rustling through the pines. As we set up our tent and gathered firewood, I felt a sense of peace wash over me. Maybe this camping thing wasn't so bad after all. That first night passed uneventfully. We roasted hot dogs and marshmallows over the fire, swapped stories, and turned in early. The next morning, we hiked a nearby trail and spent the afternoon fishing at a small lake. It was shaping up to be an ideal trip. Everything changed that second night. We were sitting by the campfire after dinner, Jake animatedly recounting some drama from school. I was only half listening, my eyes drawn to the darkness beyond our little circle of firelight. The hairs on the back of my neck suddenly stood up. I had the distinct feeling we were being watched. "Jake," I said quietly, interrupting his story. "Do you see that?" He followed my gaze, squinting into the shadows. "See what, Dad?" For a moment, I thought I glimpsed two faint pinpricks of light, like eyes reflecting our fire, but they vanished as quickly as they appeared. "Nothing," I muttered. "Must have been my imagination." We went back to talking, but I couldn't shake my unease. Every few minutes I'd scan the tree line, searching for something. I told myself I was being paranoid. We were alone out here. The nearest occupied campsite was at least a mile away. Around 10 p.m. Jake yawned and said he was turning in. I decided to stay up a bit longer, stoking the fire and enjoying the night sounds. An owl hooted in the distance. Crickets chirped. All perfectly normal. Then I heard it, a long, low howl that made my blood run cold. It wasn't a coyote or a wolf. This sound was deeper, almost guttural, and it seemed to be coming from fairly close by. I stood up, heart pounding. "Jake," I called softly. "You awake?" No response from the tent. Good. I didn't want to alarm him if it was nothing. The forest had gone eerily silent. Even the crickets had stopped their song. I strained my ears, listening for anything. Crack! The sound of a branch snapping nearby made me jump. It came from the direction of a small clearing about 50 yards from our campsite. I grabbed my flashlight, clicked it on, and swept the beam across the trees. Nothing, just shadows and leaves. I was about to turn back to the fire when movement caught my eye. A massive, dark shape was emerging from the tree line into the clearing. At first, my brain couldn't make sense of what I was seeing. It was roughly man-shaped, but impossibly tall, at least 7 or 8 feet. And the way it moved, each step covered an unnaturally long distance, like it was gliding rather than walking. I stood frozen, flashlight beam trained on the figure. It paused at the edge of the clearing, and I swear it turned to look directly at me. 2 enormous glowing eyes reflected the light. A scream built in my throat, but terror kept it locked inside. I couldn't move, couldn't breathe. We stared at each other for what felt like an eternity. Then, with horrible swiftness, the creature melted back into the forest. I don't know how long I stood there, trembling and gasping for air. Eventually, survival instinct kicked in. I needed to get Jake and get the hell out of there. I sprinted to the tent, practically diving inside. "Jake, wake up!" I hissed, shaking him roughly. He blinked at me groggily. "What, Dad? What's wrong?" "We have to go, now. Don't ask questions, just pack up." To his credit, Jake didn't argue. He must have seen the fear in my eyes. We threw our gear haphazardly into bags, not bothering to properly break down the tent. I kept looking over my shoulder, terrified of seeing that thing emerge from the darkness again. As we were shoving the last of our stuff in the car, a blood-curdling scream echoed through the forest. It sounded almost human, but distorted, too deep and too loud. "Dad?" Jake's voice quavered. "What the hell was that?" "I don't know," I said, slamming the trunk shut. "And I don't want to find out. Get in the car." We peeled out of there, tires spitting gravel. I didn't slow down until we hit the main road, my knuckles white on the steering wheel. Jake peppered me with questions, but I deflected them. How could I explain what I'd seen? I barely believed it myself. It wasn't until we were safely home, doors locked and lights blazing, that I tried to process what had happened. I knew what I saw couldn't have been human. The height, the movement, those eyes. My mind kept circling back to stories I'd dismissed as nonsense. Bigfoot, Sasquatch, the missing link. But if such a creature was real, why hadn't there been more concrete evidence? How had it stayed hidden for so long? Over the next few days, I scoured the internet for similar encounters. To my shock, there were dozens of reports from that same area of Arizona. Many described a tall, ape-like being. Some mentioned eerie howls or feeling watched. A few even talked about objects being thrown at their campsites, something I'd mercifully been spared. I debated reporting my own sighting, but ultimately decided against it. Who would believe me? I could barely believe it myself, and part of me worried that talking about it would somehow make it more real. It's been over a decade now, and I've never gone camping again. Jake still brings up that night sometimes, asking what really happened. I always change the subject. How can I tell my son that monsters are real? But on quiet nights, when the wind whispers through the trees outside my window, I'm transported back to that clearing. I see those glowing eyes boring into me. I hear that inhuman scream, and I wonder, what if it followed us home? Story 24. The sun had just set, leaving a faint glow on the horizon. As I walked towards the barn, swatting at mosquitoes, I noticed something odd in my peripheral vision. 2 orange lights hovering silently near the edge of our property. At first, I thought it must be fireflies, but these were much larger and brighter. I blinked hard, sure I was seeing things. But when I looked again, the lights were still there, floating about 20 feet off the ground. A chill ran down my spine despite the warm night. Something about those lights felt wrong, unnatural. As I stared, transfixed, the lights started to move. Slowly at first, then picking up speed, they began circling each other in a mesmerizing dance. Round and round they went, faster and faster, until they were just blurs of orange light. Then suddenly they merged into one bright orb that shot straight up into the sky and vanished. The whole thing lasted maybe 30 seconds, but it felt like time had stopped. I stood there frozen, heart pounding, trying to process what I'd just witnessed. It defied all logic. Those lights moved with purpose, intelligence even. But that was impossible, right? I sprinted back to the house in a panic, desperate to tell my parents what I'd seen. But as soon as I burst through the door, the words died in my throat. How could I possibly explain it without sounding crazy? So I said nothing, convincing myself it must have been some kind of optical illusion or trick of the light. But I couldn't shake the feeling that something truly strange had happened. That night I barely slept, replaying the incident over and over in my mind. Every sound outside my window made me jump. The next morning, I half expected my mom to mention seeing something weird too. But she acted totally normal, chatting about her plans for the day as she made breakfast. I almost brought it up, but chickened out at the last second. What if she thought I was losing it? So I kept quiet, trying my best to forget about it. But over the next few weeks, I noticed my mom acting different, jumpy, distracted, like something was weighing on her mind. Then one night, about a month later, she came home looking pale and shaken. I overheard her talking to my dad in hushed, urgent tones. Creeping closer to listen, I caught snippets about lights in the woods and following the car. A chill ran through me as I realized she must have seen them too. The next day, I couldn't stand it anymore and confronted her. "Mom, what really happened last night? Please, you can tell me." She hesitated, then sighed. "I don't know if you'll believe me, but I saw something impossible. She went on to describe driving home on the old country road that winds through the forest near our property. It was pitch black out there with no streetlights. Suddenly, 2 orange lights appeared in her rearview mirror. At first, she thought it was just another car, but the lights were moving strangely, weaving back and forth across the road. "They were following me," she said, voice shaking. "No matter how fast I drove, they stayed right behind me. Then they started to get closer and closer until they were right on top of the car. I could see them reflected on the hood, these pulsing orbs of light. I've never been so terrified in my life." She said she floored it, driving way too fast on that twisty road. Just when she thought she couldn't take it anymore, the lights abruptly vanished, gone without a trace. As she spoke, I felt a mix of relief and dread. Relief that I wasn't going crazy, that someone else had seen the lights too, but dread at the realization that something truly unexplainable was happening. After that, we started comparing notes. It turned out we'd both been keeping our experiences secret, afraid the other would think we were nuts. But now that it was out in the open, we noticed more and more strange occurrences. Sometimes at night, we'd hear odd noises coming from the woods, not normal animal sounds, but almost mechanical whirring and clicking. We'd find strange markings on the ground, perfect circles pressed into the dirt, as if something incredibly heavy had landed there. But the incident that really freaked us out happened about a week later. I woke up in the middle of the night to a loud crash outside. Peering out the window, I saw a massive oak tree at the edge of our property suddenly topple over. There was no wind, no storm. It just fell as if pushed by an invisible force. The next morning we went to inspect the fallen tree. Its trunk was nearly 3 feet thick, healthy with no signs of disease. It would have taken tremendous force to push it over like that. As we stood there puzzling over it, we heard another crash in the distance. Racing towards the sound, we found another huge tree freshly fallen. Over the next hour, 6 more trees fell in a bizarre pattern, forming a perfect circle in the woods behind our house. Standing in the middle of that circle of destruction, I felt a presence watching us. The air seemed to crackle with energy. That was the last straw for my parents. They called in some paranormal investigators, but of course nothing happened while the experts were there. We even contacted the local police and forest service, but they just chalked it up to wind damage or diseased trees. We considered moving, but this farm had been in our family for generations. We couldn't just abandon it. So we stayed, but things were never quite the same. We'd catch glimpses of those lights occasionally, always at the edges of our vision. Sometimes I'd wake up with the feeling that something had been in my room, watching me sleep. To this day, I have no explanation for what happened that summer. I've researched similar phenomena, but nothing quite matches our experience. Sometimes I wonder if I imagined it all, if it was just an overactive teenage imagination. But then I remember the fear in my mum's eyes as she described those lights chasing her car, the inexplicable destruction of those massive trees. Whatever it was, it felt intelligent, purposeful, like it was studying us, testing our reactions. Sometimes I still get the feeling we're being observed, even now, years later. I'll be out for a walk in the woods, and suddenly all the birds will go silent. The hairs on the back of my neck stand up. In those moments, I know in my bones that we're not alone out here. I don't talk about it much these days. People tend to look at you funny when you start rambling about mysterious lights and fallen trees. But I know what I saw, what my family experienced. Something unexplainable visited our little farm in Wisconsin that summer. And sometimes, on quiet nights when I'm back home visiting, I find myself watching the tree line, half expecting to see those eerie orange lights appear once again. Story 25. It must have been around midnight when I woke up needing to pee. I didn't want to wake my parents, so I quietly unzipped the tent and stepped out into the cool night air. The campfire had died down to embers, casting an eerie red glow. The forest was pitch black beyond our little clearing. I walked a little ways from the campsite, just far enough to have some privacy. The woods were so quiet, unnaturally quiet, now that I think about it. No crickets chirping, no rustling leaves. Just dead silence. I remember getting goosebumps, but I tried to ignore the creepy feeling. As I was finishing up, I heard a twig snap somewhere in the darkness to my left. I froze, my heart suddenly pounding. I told myself it was probably just a deer or something, but deep down I knew this was different. The silence felt oppressive now, like the whole forest was holding its breath. I started to turn, ready to bolt back to the tent, when I saw it. Just for a split second, illuminated by a shaft of moonlight, a face peering out from behind a tree about 20 feet away. But it wasn't human. It was huge, covered in dark fur, with deep-set eyes that reflected the moonlight. In that moment, our eyes locked, and I felt a jolt of primal terror unlike anything I've ever experienced. I ran. I ran faster than I ever had in my life, my bare feet pounding against roots and rocks. I could hear heavy footsteps crashing through the underbrush behind me. Whatever it was big, and it was chasing me. I burst into our campsite, screaming for my parents. My dad came stumbling out of the tent, disoriented and alarmed. I was crying hysterically, trying to explain what I'd seen between gasping breaths. We could hear something large moving in the woods nearby, branches snapping. My dad grabbed his flashlight and shotgun, shining the beam into the trees. For a moment, I saw two glowing eyes reflecting back at us from the darkness. Then they were gone. We spent the rest of the night huddled in the tent, wide awake and on edge. My dad kept the shotgun close, but we didn't hear or see anything else. When dawn finally came, we packed up camp in record time and got the hell out of there. On the drive home, my parents tried to convince me I'd just seen a bear and let my imagination run wild. But I knew what I saw wasn't a bear. Those eyes. They were too intelligent, too aware. That face is burned into my memory. For years afterward, I had nightmares about that night. I'd wake up in a cold sweat, my heart racing. As I got older, I started to doubt my own memory. Maybe I really had just seen a bear and blown it out of proportion in my mind. But then, about 10 years ago, I was browsing in a bookstore and came across a book about Bigfoot encounters. I flipped it open out of idle curiosity and felt my blood run cold. There on the page was a sketch of a face, the exact face I'd seen that night in the woods. The deep-set eyes, the flat nose, the heavy brow. It was like looking at a photo of my memory. I bought the book and devoured it, along with every other book on the subject I could find. The more I read about other people's encounters, the more certain I became. What I saw that night was real. It wasn't a bear. It wasn't my imagination. It was a Sasquatch. I've spent countless hours since then trying to make sense of what happened. Why was it there? Was it just curious about us? Or did it have more sinister intentions? I'll never know for sure. But I do know that there are things out there in the wilderness that defy explanation. Things that most people write off as legends or campfire stories. I've never gone camping again. Just the thought of being out in the woods at night makes my palms sweat. I can still hear those heavy footsteps sometimes when I close my eyes. Still see those intelligent, inhuman eyes staring back at me from the darkness. I didn't talk about my experience for a long time. Who would believe me? But now that I'm retired, I feel like it's important to share what happened. Not to convince anyone, but just to add my voice to the many others who've had encounters they can't explain. I know there are skeptics out there who'll say, I just saw a bear, or that my memory has twisted things over time. And maybe they're right. But I know what I saw. I know what I felt in that moment when our eyes met. It wasn't human, but it wasn't just an animal either. There was an intelligence there, a presence that I've never encountered before or since. Sometimes I wonder if it's still out there, roaming the forests of California, if other campers have locked eyes with it in the dark of night, feeling that same jolt of primordial fear. I hope not, for their sake. But I know the truth. There are things in this world that we don't understand, things that lurk just beyond the edge of the firelight. I'm not trying to scare anyone or discourage people from enjoying nature. But I do think it's important to keep an open mind and remember that we don't know everything. There are still mysteries out there, still unexplored frontiers, and sometimes, if you're not careful, those mysteries might just reach out and touch you in the night. That summer night in '68 changed me forever. It opened my eyes to a world beyond what I thought I knew, a world where legend and reality blur together in the shadows, a world where a curious boy can lock eyes with a creature that shouldn't exist and carry that moment with him for the rest of his life. I don't have any profound conclusions to draw from my experience. I can't explain what I saw or why it was there. All I know is what happened to me and the impact it's had on my life. I still love nature, still feel drawn to the wilderness, but now I approach it with a mix of wonder and wariness, because I know firsthand that there are things out there beyond our understanding, things that can change your entire worldview in the blink of an eye. So the next time you're out camping and you hear an unexplained sound in the night or feel like you're being watched from the shadows, remember my story. Keep an open mind, and maybe, just maybe, think twice before wandering off alone into the dark.